Now we've talked about the Gilded Age and what's going on in the eastern part of the country. Now let's look at what's going on in the American West. And you're going to see how all of this ties together and how the West and the East need each other to grow, not only to increase industrialization, but to increase the growth of the country economically, population-wise, across from one sea to the other. That fulfilling of manifest destiny is now starting to really fulfill itself in the sense that Americans are really starting to move west, really starting to make the American West, and what we mean by that is west of the Mississippi River here, is starting to make it their home and starting to make it their own and starting to claim the land as Americans as opposed to just being this empty frontier. We're going to see how things like mining and transportation, ranching and agriculture all form to create this unique American West identity, but also to create a unique American identity as well. It's going to come through the hardships of those vocations, and it's also going to come through hardships with even more wars that they fight during and after the Civil War with the Native Americans in the West as well, and how we treat the Native Americans and how the Native Americans treat Americans and settlers and all this kind of stuff will really form the identity of the West and also create this unique American identity as well. So let's take a look and see how this all happens. The mineral rushes of the 19th century stimulated settlement, forced the early formation of laws and government, created a demand for transportation, and lured labor and capital westward. Waves of pioneers swept into California, Nevada, Idaho, Montana, and the Dakota Territories, drawn by the lure of discovering their own city of gold, their own El Dorado. Now, many of these prospectors, miners, investors, and Camptown followers moved from the east to the west, but many also moved in from the Pacific coast into the hinterland. Places like Sutter's Mill, California in 1848, and Virginia City, Nevada in the 1850s. Areas of Montana and Wyoming in the 1860s, and the Black Hills and the Dakotas all saw rushes of prospectors followed by makeshift towns filled with lawyers and merchants, gamblers and prostitutes. You know, that Wild West stuff that you always hear about. The onslaught of gold production led to the rise in the United States' role in world trade and foreign investment in the West. The exportation of gold also helped pave the way for things like railroads, factories, mills, and more technologically advanced mining equipment and techniques. These factors combined led to an expansion of credit in the West and the rise of the United States as a world economic player. And the reason why is because all of those precious metals and materials are being sent east, which increases our wealth. It also allows industrialists to build more things. So you see how all of this is starting to work together. Now, mining rushes began with the initial discovery by a prospector, followed by communication of the news to miners elsewhere who would soon arrive looking for their own bonanza. Of course, when men find gold, they can't keep their mouth shut. You know, if you went out and found, a vein of gold, you're not going to be able to keep it to yourself. Now, you may try really hard, but somebody's going to notice. Somebody's going to notice if you don't say anything. Somebody's going to notice, hey, he's buying more supplies, or he's hitting the whorehouse a lot more often. Like, what's Bill got? What did Bill find? Right? And so either way, somebody's going to follow Bill, or he's going to open his big mouth, and all of a sudden you got more people coming out there, or somebody kills Bill for his gold, right? So that's how all this kind of starts. It's not always this, oh, hey guys, I found this gold. Oh, hey, cool, Bill, let's all go get it together. Like, that doesn't happen. It's a lot more violent than that usually. Now, within a short amount of time, capital requirements brought in numerous corporate investors and entrepreneurs, even as the community moved from tents, like you see here in the picture, that's the very beginnings of a mining town or a mining boom town there. You got the miners and their wives there. You even have a couple of pet deer because it's the West, I guess, right? And they move from these kind of canvas tents or tar paper shacks to more wood based buildings, and eventually they get to brick and mortar buildings as well. And the rapid transformation of the area brought a lot of social chaos and physical change, cultural amenities, and vigilante law. Everyone involved in the mining process needed the protection of the law. However, there was no American legal precedence in this matter, so parties involved borrowed heavily from English and Spanish mining laws to form their own codes of conduct and to protect their own interests. And these codes ended up being the basis for territorial, state, and national mining laws because they didn't have it and they needed that protection. So they just kind of mishmashed all of these laws together and said, well, this works well for the English. Well, this works well for the Spanish. Well, maybe it works for us. And then it just kind of all amalgamates into this one thing here. And if you've ever been out in, say, Colorado or California or Nevada, you may have come across some of these old boom towns that once the gold or silver or copper or zinc or whatever they're doing runs dry, it's just abandoned. And you'll even see things left on tables and stuff, like people were just there and just vanished. And a lot of time that's what happened, is somebody would come around and say, oh, gold's gone, and everybody just dropped the stuff and leave, because what's the point of being there anymore? It's really kind of eerie, especially if you're up in the Rockies and you come across a random abandoned town or a random abandoned house or something that has no markers or anything. It's just sitting there. It's a little eerie. It's kind of cool in the sense that, wow, somebody lived here and then just dropped all their stuff and left for some reason, hopefully a good reason, not a bad reason. But it is also a little eerie to just kind of come across those kind of ruins out there in the middle of the mountains or in the middle of the plains somewhere. And all that comes from the gold and silver and mining booms and busts that were going on during the time. Now, despite all of these democratic actions that people are trying to take, whether, let's just assume that Bill was a nice guy and shared his gold with everybody, the western mining towns were still subject to lynchings and shootings, as well as blatant disregard for Native American and Hispanic land claims. Mining rushes produced not only a demand for mining laws, but also for land offices, marshals, sheriffs, local governments, which led to an early adoption of territorial governments and eventually full statehood. In essence, the mining rushes started and hastened the arrival of government in the West because people wanted protection. The idea of the Wild West and, the guy riding in and shooting the town up and, having posses go after and get him, that kind of stuff. Sure, that stuff happened, but it wasn't obviously as glamorous as they like to portray in Hollywood movies. Right? I mean, people were just like, that dude can't be going and shooting people. This is ridiculous. Like, we got to do something about it. It wasn't like, oh, here comes Black Bart in. Oh, God. What do we all do? The town is terrified. Somebody be like, we got to go shoot that asshole. That's how it would be more than likely. We have to go arrest him. So, Hollywood likes to play that kind of stuff up. And those types of things did happen. And some of the stories are even better than fiction or crazier than fiction. But it wasn't this everyday occurrence that's going on that people like to have you believe. It still happened, but it was definitely different in the sense of how all these things take place. And so there was still a lot of violence and a lot of lawlessness, but people wouldn't just sit in their cabins and be like, well, I guess we're going to get terrorized today. They would actually try to do things to stop it. So, the extraction of gold, silver, copper, lead, zinc, and other metals employed thousands of men across much of the Trans-Mississippi West. For decades, mining and payloads such as the Comstock lode in Nevada, Gregory Gulch in Colorado, and the Anaconda mines in Montana represented the largest non-agricultural sources of jobs in the West. Hard rock mining supplanted placer operations, and minings became more corporate. More miners became day or week laborers, paid to work in underground gangs to harvest ore deep within the hills and the mines. So you kind of go from this, what we typically think of prospectors and stuff like that, a guy like you see there panning for gold in the river going, woo, I found me a nugget. It goes from more of that to, hey, I found this large vein of gold, and you have to get machines and labor and all this kind of stuff to pull that ore out of the rocks, and which leads to those guys eventually going from panning for gold to working for a company, either daily or weekly or monthly or what have you. And the reason why you work daily or weekly or monthly is because life in the tunnels was hard. It was dangerous. It was monotonous, which led to this highly mobile and unstable workforce. Itinerants became the norm in the area as they moved from silver mines in Nevada to the Dakota gold fields to copper mines in Montana. Some miners shifted professions and became smelters or railroad construction workers or factory workers. Many miners, what do you think they were? Like, if you were to describe a miner in the West, what's going to come to your mind? They're probably younger. Of course, you probably maybe consider or picturing a guy with a beard and missing some teeth, so maybe he looks older than he is. But he's single and he's mobile. And most of these guys failed to settle down or form families or create roots in any one location. They, would move from place to place, get tired of one thing or get tired of one place, or run into some problems in a place and just leave. And so there's this constant turnover of people moving in and out of areas, one place after another. Yet the sense of adventure and abundant employment opportunities attracted workers from around the globe to the Western mines. And so with all this labor, you're also going to draw in labor from other places, not just in America. And a key characteristic of the labor force was its ethnic and racial diversity. The Chinese were the biggest single ethnic group in the mining towns. But, of course, with the Chinese coming in, you're going to have some problems with some of the other miners. Namely, you're going to have problems with the white miners. Now, typically, the interesting thing is that the Chinese and Hispanic miners often accepted the least skilled and lowest paying jobs, such as dumping cars, removing rubble, cooking food, washing clothes, that kind of stuff. The highest levels of discrimination against Chinese and Hispanic workers came from European immigrants, not Americans. You find this weird kind of dichotomy where most of the American workers, namely the white American workers, really didn't care one way or the other about who was working alongside them. They just wanted to get it done. They wanted to get their money in the end. Now, obviously, there's going to be exceptions to that rule, just like there's exceptions to any rule. But the main discrimination against the Chinese and Hispanic workers came from the European immigrants that came into America to work in the mines. And especially immigrants from the British Isles, Germany, and Eastern Europe really didn't want to work with the Chinese workers. So you end up having an ethnic pecking order develop where men from the British Isles and Americans worked in the mines. They were doing the most dangerous job. And you're thinking, why are they doing the most dangerous? If they're at the top of the pecking order, shouldn't they be doing the easiest? Well, no. In mines, the most dangerous job is also the highest paying job, because there's a risk of, mine collapses or gas or whatever coming in. And so you get paid more. by taking the more dangerous jobs. So they would be deep down in the mines doing all of the, rock labor, pulling it out of the rocks and doing all that kind of stuff. Then, after that, or next on the chain, would be Southern and Eastern Europeans. And they would load the carts, they would push the carts out of the mine and go back and do it again. And then the Chinese and the Hispanic workers did the rest. Typically, the Hispanic workers were the next in line. They would be the ones that would unload the carts or shift things out. And the Chinese workers would essentially do anything else. They would do the odd jobs. They would cook and clean, things like that. Now, one of the most dangerous jobs was actually given to the Chinese. And some of you may know what that is. And that's dealing with dynamite. And the dynamite stuff, if you don't know, dynamite is extremely unstable. The active ingredient in dynamite is nitroglycerin. And when nitroglycerin gets any sort of moisture into it, it becomes highly unstable, where you could be walking along holding a stick of dynamite in your hand, and you're walking on a flat surface and you just happen to kick a rock or something. That could be enough for that dynamite to explode in your hand. That's how unstable it could be. So they would give dynamite working to the Chinese, because you can accomplish a lot of things in life if you throw a lot of human pain and suffering at things and don't care. Like, let's be honest, right? And that's what they did. We saw it in the East, right? You're having children getting ground up in gears and all that kind of stuff. Same kind of principle applies. Well, I don't really care about these people, so I'm just going to throw pain and suffering at them because I need, a hole blown in that mountain. And so the Chinese would be the ones to set the dynamite and deal with the dynamite. If a couple of them exploded or got caught up in an avalanche or whatever, they'd be like, well, all right, there's more Chinese workers. It's just the way it was. And so everybody knew these risks going into working in these places. So obviously the extraordinarily threatening conditions and working in the mines led to the first organized labor action. And the first organized labor action in America was a strike in the Comstock Lode in 1864, so during the Civil War. So what we have happen here is the Miners Protective Association, the first union in America, the Miners Protective Association, sought higher wages, shorter hours, and better working conditions, just like all workers are trying to do, right? I mean, I think we get all like higher wages, shorter hours, and better working conditions. Now, the union used monthly dues to help injured workers and the families of those who were killed in the mines. And they talked a lot about dangerous conditions and trying to improve those. Like you can see there in the picture there, those mines are just held up by wood beams and things like that. Those can collapse, those can break. Another danger that you may not know was natural gas, because they're digging in these rocks and they could hit a patch of natural gas and they wouldn't know, because natural gas is odorless, colorless, tasteless, but it can kill you fairly quickly. So I don't know if you know this or not, but the miners would use canaries. And you'd have canaries down in the mines. You may have seen this in cartoons or something like that. And what do canaries do? Canaries, they chirp all the time. That's why, if you see like gangster movies or something like that, they always say, oh, he sings like a canary. That means he's just constantly running his mouth, right? And that's what canaries do. They're just chirp, 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 all the time. Well, I mean, probably for the miners, it served a dual purpose. One, it's kind of nice to have, a bird singing down there. I guess it's kind of like their Spotify or something at that point, right? So at least they're hearing something other than just the clanking of tools and stuff all day. They hear a bird chirping. But if that bird's chirping constantly, then all of a sudden it's not. That means that bird dropped dead. And that bird dropped dead from natural gas. So if the bird quit chirping, it was time to get the hell out of there, because somebody hit a natural gas leak, and Obviously, it kills the little canary much quicker than it's going to kill a full-grown man. So they would all get out of the mine and see what they could do about the natural gas. So those are the kind of dangers that they would have down there. So now the union used these monthly dues to help injured workers and the families of those killed in the mines, and these labor movements spread throughout the mining towns in the West. Soon, new groups formed, like the Western Federation of Miners and the Industrial Workers of the World, sprang up from these labor disputes. And the mining corporations inspired the rise of unions by refusing to discuss basic issues with their employees and importing people who would cross picket lines, known as scabs. They would call in the National Guard. They would file injunctions and get strikes. So you have all of this turmoil going on within the mining community itself. Mining, though, created wealth, it generated labor problems, and it laid the foundation for an expanding national economy. The discovery of gold, silver, copper created an enormous demand for transportation and placed a heavy burden on the existing shipping facilities between the coasts. Before the Mexican-American War in 1846, vessels from the United States, mainly New England, sailed the coasts of California and traded in goods such as coffee, sugar, cloth, clothes, spices, metal objects, etc., etc. Voyages of a year to 18 months could generate profits of up to 300%. Shipping companies knew the routes and risks involved in doing business in California, mainly the loss of ships and cargo going around Cape Horn out from South America. As you can see there on the map, they would have to go a long way around before the Panama Canal. Now, they actually did build a railroad across Panama that opened in 1855, which reduced the time and risks of a trip, but this improvement did not address the costs of shipping the cargo or shipping passengers. In fact, it raised it a lot because you'd have to go to Panama, unload everything on the ship, put it on the railroad, send the railroad across Panama, have another ship waiting on the other side for them. It's not like the ship that they were on will just sail around and pick them back up. You have to have another ship there to pick them up, load everything back on, and then go about your way. So it may be less risky, but it's definitely more costly. So they tried to do an effort for a mail route, actually through Mexico at the Isthmus there in Mexico. And that made clear to Congress, the U.S. Congress, that land routes across the American middle were absolute necessities. An overland mail route had to be established as freight and passenger traffic to California sold because of the gold rush and all that stuff. First, mail companies and overland freighters used animal power to cross the continent. However, these solutions proved to be temporary until railroad tracks, what they called iron paths, crossed the country, and it was really forcing Congress to address the workability of a transcontinental railroad. But even as demands for an overland route grew, shipping firms established a triangular trade across the Pacific. You can see it there on the map. So what they would do is, after unloading passengers and cargo in California, ship captains had nothing to haul back to the East Coast. And you don't want to go back to the East Coast empty-handed. You don't want to make that long trip with an empty ship. So to maximize profits and space, they loaded masts, spars, lumber, gold, silver, anything that they could take, and they would carry those things to Japan or China. There, of course, then they would unload, sell all their raw materials and things like that. But then you're further away from home, and now you have an empty ship. So what are you going to do? Well, there in China and Japan, they acquired tea, spices, rice, Chinese luxury goods, and then they turn around to sail back to ultimately New York, Boston, London, wherever. As early as the 1850s, the gold rush had already vaulted California into a global capitalistic economy. Trade with Asia heightened the demands for an overland route to the West Coast from the East Coast. Well, the Mexican cession in 1848 meant that the U.S. Army had to establish forts and garrisons throughout the region to protect settlers and traders. The discovery of gold filled the trails with even more people, and the central route soon saw caravans of Conestoga wagons heading to California and Oregon. The needs of the military reached mammoth proportions as troop contingents increased in size to protect the caravans. The government alone would have generated vast freighting operations by itself, but the gold rushes and demands to meet needs of newly founded Indian reservations exacerbated the demands. The response to this need came from large freighting firms, which were heavily subsidized, but with access to substantial capital as well. So the government would give them money, but then they also had other investors pumping in money to their freighting operations. Now, the Civil War led to a consolidation of Western mail and freight operations as the government demanded more frequent and faster service to California. There was a company that ended up dominating all of this called the Overland Mail Company. Yes, very unique name, I know, the Overland Mail Company. And the reason why they were able to take off is because around the time of the end of the Civil War, a lot of those mail companies and overland freighting companies went bankrupt or they went under. And the Overland Mail Company was one of the few that was able to stay afloat, and they even bought up some of their other smaller competition. And the Overland Mail Company was run by two men, Henry Wells and William Fargo. You may be thinking, wait a second. Wells Fargo? Wells Fargo. Wells Fargo started out as a stage company, essentially a stagecoach company that ran mail everywhere. And eventually they're going to get out of the mailing company and go into, once they sell that, go into banking. And then we all know what Wells Fargo has done. So maybe they should have stuck to shipping. But they established a virtual monopoly in the coaching and freighting business west of the Mississippi River. But besides stagecoaches and things like that, you also had steamboats going the interior waterways that the freighters couldn't reach and made many men rich. However, their days of economic prosperity were numbered with the introduction of the railroads. So demands for a national transcontinental railroad started to grow from politicians and businessmen because of the relatively cheap, fast, and effective way to deliver people and cargo across the continent. So members of Congress largely agreed that a transcontinental railroad had to be built, but disagreed on where it would end, what they called the terminus line. Of course, acting in its time-honored fashion, Congress asked for a study of all feasible routes and thereby postponed a decision, because that's what Congress likes to do. Now, the secession of the Confederacy, the need for transportation to the West in a time of war, and some of the senators pushing for this gained passage of what we call the Pacific Railroad Act in 1861. So it's mainly the South and the Civil War that really pushed forward this idea of a transcontinental railroad for the Union. And they passed that Pacific Railroad Act in 1861. Now, the act provided for seemingly substantial subsidization of the project, yet even these inducements failed to generate any sort of significant private capital to initiate work on what they called the Union Pacific. Congress responded in 1864 by doubling those incentives, which garnered enough capital. However, the incredible expense of building a transcontinental railroad staggered even the most optimistic of the Union Pacific's leaders. And the government loads failed to approach even the minimal construction costs. I guess they didn't figure out how big the country was, I guess, at that point. I mean, that's the only thing I could think of is why they didn't put so much money into it, is they just didn't realize the distance or the material or anything like that. And they had doubled it from 3 years before. So that should tell you how small the initial thing was. So the leaders of the Union Pacific turned to what they called the credit mobiler, which gave them money. And the credit mobiler was a little shady. And maybe not everything was on the up and up with the credit mobiler and the people who were running that. but they had to do what they had to do. They received contracts, they lured investors with these contracts, and they doubled their investment dollars. So they're trying to get this built. But of course, there was corruption and bribes the politician. But that did not deter the survey and construction crews of the Union Pacific and their competitor, the Central Pacific, who was getting their own capital to build. And you can see on the map, they start building their ways opposite one another. The Central Pacific is going from the West Coast inward, and the Union Pacific starts in Omaha and starts building west. Well, as the competing construction crews are about to pass each other, Congress stepped in and ordered the rails to be joined. They said, okay, this is getting out of hand. We're not going to have two transcontinental railroads and y'all just passing one another. So meet up so we can have at least one railroad and get this started. So Congress orders them to join the rails at a place called Promontory, Utah. So they go to Promontory, Utah. On May 10th, 1869, workers and officials observed the placement of the last tie of the railroad. It was a laurel wood bound in silver. It's very fancy type of wood bound and wrapped in silver. And the last spike of the rail was, of course, made of gold. The construction of the railroad made millions of dollars for a few men, and some of them reinvested their profits into the region, further stimulating the economy. And you can see here, this is them celebrating the final product of the Transcontinental Railroad. The two railroads coming together, placing the last thing. You see them shaking hands and putting all this stuff in, right? And all the workers that had worked on it were there. And of course, you can see a bunch of people there, but there's even more people off to the sides and to the back and on the other side. So not everybody got in the picture, including a lot of the Chinese workers. They actually had Chinese workers at the celebration and everything, from what I've read, and they just didn't make the picture because, you know, they're all spread out and all the sorts of stuff. There's a lot more people there than just those people there in the picture. And so, but they're all celebrating, hey, we finally have a transcontinental railroad. And this transcontinental railroad also spurned others to build railroads to rival the Union Pacific, such as the Northern Pacific and the Southern Pacific, because, again, we're really creative with our names. Now, the spread of transportation did not stop in the West with just railroads, did it? The introduction of the automobile in the early 20th century led to the creation of paved roads, state highways, and the interstate highway system. There you can see a map of all the interstate highways that we've built since World War II. And of course, most of us are familiar with I-35, I-20, I-10, I-45, all the major ones, I-40, all the ones that run through Texas. But there you have the whole mapping system of how the interstate system works. Of course, the north and south ones end in 5, and the ones that run east and west end in 0s. So that's how you know which way you're going. If you didn't know that, hopefully if you're driving, you know what the interstate system numbers meant, right? Now, the first passenger airlines emerged after World War II, allowed people to go from California to New York in as little as 5 hours, 6 hours. There you can see all of the major airports, obviously not the little municipalities or minor airports and things like that, but all of the major airports in America. And of course, flight makes things a lot quicker as opposed to you getting in your Conestoga wagon in, Pittsburgh and traveling all the way to Salt Lake City or Las Vegas or Dallas and it taking 3 to 6 months to get there, or even on a train and still taking a few weeks. Now you can get on a plane and fly there in a matter of hours. So the constant improvement in transportation has changed people's views on the West. From being a far-off kind of dangerous land that they read in dime store novels about outlaws and Indians and gold miners and cave-in, all this kind of mysterious, mythical place that the West has become in American lore. Now it's a place where those who are rich enough or desperate enough could go and visit anyone, no matter their station in life, right? So it didn't matter what position you were in life. You could be rich, you could be poor, you could get to the West fairly quickly. And it's not really that big a deal. Some people even make day trips across the country if you're so inclined. So we can see that the spread of transportation really shapes the West and shapes how people viewed the West and what was all going on, and even still how Western ideology and the idea of transportation getting out to the West shapes the country as a whole. Now we get to something that most Texans are definitely familiar with: ranching and beef. Now, the story of beef is much different than it is throughout the entirety of the rest of the East. It's definitely unique to the West in the sense of how beef became so huge and the subsequent shaping of the societies around ranching in the West as compared to the East. Now, why late 19th century Americans wanted such vast quantities of beef is not really immediately obvious. Americans have not always chosen beef over other meats, but that's what we like to eat now. Beef is everywhere. How many places serve hamburgers and all that kind of stuff, right? Steakhouses. Everything we do in America, if you say, what's your favorite type of meat? People are going to say beef. Now, of course, people are going to say, oh, I love bacon. Bacon, I love bacon. But what do you like bacon on? Typically, you like it on your beef, right? So, if consumers had wanted chicken or pork more or had decided not to eat meat at all, yeah, right. The history of the West would have been considerably different, though. Before the Civil War, urbanites preserved pork, but even then it appears that their desires were turning to fresh beef. Pork may have been on their tables, but beef was in their fantasies. Don't get dirty with it, right? If the food, if it was the food that managed to denote both high status and down to earth Americanism, right? That beef was this whole type of thing like only rich people can eat beef, but you're American if you eat beef. It's kind of odd that way. Even now you have your fancy steakhouses, but every red-blooded American wants to go eat a steak on Friday night, you know? In fact, beef was even the center of political campaigning. In 1840, William Henry Harrison capitalized on his Indian fighting, his log cabin upbringing, which he actually didn't have because he grew up in a brick house in Virginia, but hey, whatever, and his diet of raw beef and salt to create the image of this democratic American. He said he loved raw beef, salt, and whiskey. And of course, an American president's going to like that kind of stuff. Well, his opponent, who was President Martin Van Buren at the time, Van Buren was painted as having a weakness for French food and aristocratic tendencies. Well, Harrison won the presidency. And beef in the ranching business has influenced American diets, culture, and even biological research from the days of the cattle drives to the modern science lab. Now, plentiful grass in the West and Eastern markets' hunger for beef was necessary, but not sufficient conditions for a prosperous Western cattle industry. Range-fed cattle from the grasslands initially proved to have tough, stringy meat. And this wasn't very good. That kind of meat only captured the bottom end of the growing beef trade. Typically, cheaper cuts of meat in American cities and cured beef for the trade with England, because the English don't know good beef if it literally kicked them in the face. All right, middle class Americans, though, they desired fattier, tenderer meat that was tastier and just good. And so they bought a lot of corn-fed Midwestern beef. Well, what changed all that in the West was the iconic Texas Longhorn. Hook 'em horns. Now, the Longhorns provided the first inroads into Eastern markets for Western farmers and Western ranchers. Now, Texas Longhorns, their genetic makeup made them resistant to almost all tick-borne viruses and diseases. They were able to survive well in harsh climates, whether very hot or very cold. And they could thrive on grass and get fat off grass with no supplemental feed, like having to feed them corn or anything like that. They could just get fat off grass. By the end of the Civil War, Longhorns made up the majority of the roughly 5 million cattle in Texas. And most of these cattle were unbranded and manageable, unlike feral cattle, which made them easier to take. They're pretty docile for the most part, especially when they were wild cattle. They'd just kind of be like, hey, Longhorns, come over here. And they're like, okay. So, they're pretty easy to do all these things, and their genetic makeup made them a great beef cattle. The Longhorns' biology, though, also worked against them when it came time to drive the cattle to market. Because the Longhorns carried something called Texas fever, carried by ticks. Now, Longhorns were immune to the disease, but when they were driven out of Texas, the cattle still carried the ticks with them that carried the disease. Northern farmers did not know how the disease was communicated. I mean, they didn't know about microbiology and stuff at that time. They didn't know how that kind of thing worked. All they knew is that every time Texas Longhorns came into their fields, their livestock caught Texas fever and died. Well, the Texans, who never saw their livestock die from the disease, denied that the disease existed or that it did not come from the Longhorns, which makes sense. Because these other farmers are saying, hey, you're spreading disease and all my animals are dying. And the Texans are saying, our animals aren't, so it can't be ours. Right? That makes sense because they don't know how the disease is communicated. So, ticks, as much as markets, determine the initial course of the plains cattle industry. When Texans tried to drive their herds north after the Civil War, farmers violently protested their passage, which shut down access to those northern and northeastern markets. In fact, you even have farmers and cowboys killing each other over this. That's how crazy this got over this Texas fever. So, Texas cattle had to stay west of the line of agricultural settlement, which meant that the initial post-war markets for Texans were pulled northwest to the mines, the military posts, and Indian reservations of the West. So a tick, held all of these potential profits from the plains cattle hostage. And it might have remained that way until ranchers realized that ticks could not survive a hard freeze. Well, cowboys figured out that when cattle were held on a northern range until a really hard frost, the cattle could be safely shipped, and that cattle that spent a year or more fattening up on the central and northern plains before shipping were free of fever. Cattlemen didn't know how, but they knew that the isolation and hard plains winters were freeing up the profits held hostage by Texas fever, because all the ticks would just freeze and die off, and of course the Longhorns, with their biological makeup, can survive those harsh winters pretty easily. And so then, hey, there's no fever. None of the other animals are getting sick. I guess the disease is gone. Okay, well, now let's just drive our Longhorns up to the northern plains, freeze them for a winter, and fine and ready to go. Okay, I don't know how it works, but hey, that's what works. And that's what they went with. So, okay. So now we got this opening of numerous cattle trails that can now take these Longhorns north into the northeast. And it led to a creation of cow towns in Texas and in Kansas, such as Fort Worth, which is also, known as Cowtown, Abilene, not Abilene, Texas, but Abilene, Kansas, Dodge City, Hays, those type of places that you can see on the map. And you can see all those cattle trails and where they would go. Of course, the most famous one running through the middle of Texas is the Chisholm Trail. But all four of those were major trails that they would take the cattle to get them to rail yards to ship whichever way. Now, even if the cattlemen could get to the northern markets, it needed to be mass produced, and they could not happen until beef could be preserved, right? Because, I mean, if you do all this, the meat may go bad, right? Like if you slaughter them there, the meat may go bad and all this kind of stuff, right? So what would happen is that they would typically have to send the cattle, like load the cattle up and then send them east alive. So you're shipping a lot of things that you don't necessarily need, right? Like you're shipping the horns, you're shipping the hooves, stuff like that you're not going to use, but it's taking up space. Okay? But you had to do that because if you butcher them there and then send them east, the meat may go rancid and bad before you can have a chance to sell it, or it may go bad quickly after sale, and that doesn't look good for you. So the refrigerated railroad car solved this problem. Refrigeration allowed shippers to avoid paying freight on all the unedible portions of the cattle, which led to a bitter competition between the old livestock shippers and the newer, more technologically minded beef buyers. And because the production of refrigerated beef demanded industrial slaughterhouses, refrigerated train cars, and a coordinated marketing network, capital costs to start all this were high. And a few industrialists cornered up to 80% of the beef production market by 1900. So again, you see that Gilded Age type of robber baron type mentality even getting into the beef market here, in the ranching market. Because those guys at the railheads there, they figured, hey, if we can provide a service to slaughter the cattle here and do all this kind of stuff, then we can make a lot of money, and the ranchers can make money, because then the ranchers don't have to pay to ship them. The ranchers, you can just take them there and get them slaughtered there. So everybody in the West is making money, and those old guys in the East that were used to butchering and doing all that stuff, well, they're not making money. But is that the Western guy's problem? No. And do you think the Eastern people like having cheaper, better beef? Absolutely. So, and you can see like what these refrigerated cars look like at the time, right? So they, like the inside of the tank there, you see that, they would butcher them all up. They would hang up the meat racks there, and then they would have ice, and the ice would let off cool air, and you can see the top of the car there, and then they would filter it up to the top, and then, of course, cool air does what? Goes down to the bottom, right? So they would constantly try to pump up that, ice up into the top, and then the cool air that would circulate would fall to the bottom and keep everything cool. Now, even with the new markets and refrigeration, all this cool stuff, what turned out to be the cattleman's best and most favorite tool was barbed wire. In the early 1880s, cattle ranchers eagerly used this new technology to defend their grass. Now, before the invention of barbed wire, cattle raisers had bitterly opposed fencing laws designed to confine cattle. Because how are you supposed to drive them up north if you run into fences everywhere, right? So they vehemently opposed, saying, no, fence, it should be free range, open range, right? We got to get our cattle to market. Fences are going to stop us from doing that. But inexpensive barbed wire changed their minds. In the early 1880s, ranchers fenced vast acreages, even of public domain, public roads, to keep competitors out. And they would just string wire along a road. Somebody would come along and be like, that's a public road. And be like, no, that's mine. It's mine now. That's my fence. That's mine now. And like, it was a road yesterday. Well, not today. Right? So they just started fencing everything that they could. So they're trying to keep those competitors out. They're trying to cut labor costs by preventing their cattle from drifting, right? And to ensure that they're improved bulls, right? Because they're, getting and starting to breed better cattle, breed better bulls. They didn't want these newly improved bulls to, let's say, waste their precious bodily fluids on neighboring cattle, if you catch my drift, right? I'll give you a second. Okay, got it? Okay, good. If not, have somebody explain to you. So, when smaller cattle raisers violently objected, because they don't have the money or the resources or whatever to fence off this vast amount of area, the result was fence cutting wars, such as the ones that erupted in Texas in the mid-1880s. And when we say fence cutting wars, we mean actual wars. People were actually killing each other over fencing. Okay? You know, people coming around cutting fences, killing people that are cutting fences, killing people that are putting up fences, all this kind of stuff over barbed wire fencing. And people are killing each other over this stuff. So see, people have been killing each other over stupid things for a long, long time. Well, as these large cattle corporations sealed their own demise with oversaturated markets and land disputes, you know what animal started to become more popular on the plains? Sheep. Sheep. Some people say, oh, pigs, clearly. But no, sheep. Sheep became more popular. And especially with the violence between the cattle people and the fencing people. And then even the violence made it over to the sheep people. And all that erupted in the 1890s. And by World War I, the cattle market had dipped dramatically. However, beef became the choice meat again and experienced a boom after World War II. And this is when we enter into what they call in the ranching business the age of biochemistry in ranching, where new breeds of cattle were introduced in the 1940s and 50s. And these cattle breeds were essentially made in a lab. And you could see what they would do here and try to, you see the flow chart of how they crossbred cattle in a more modern age to try to come up with better beef cattle. And not only did they start making better cattle or better breeds of cattle, they started to expand American beef markets as well. And you know, you had those commercials that you saw like at the beginning, beef, it's what's for dinner, and you know, all that kind of stuff, right? And you even started to have the expansion of Western beef markets. Now, obviously, other countries have beef markets and things like that, but Americans started to export a lot of their newly found cow embryos. In fact, China, like for example, in China, Chinese beef for a long time was known to be at best subpar, right? And you know, really kind of tasteless, kind of stringy, just kind of gross. Well, in the 1980s, a group of cattlemen from Texas went over there and presented the Chinese agricultural minister with an entire herd of American-made cattle that were made in the lab. And you know, you may be thinking, well, how did they transport a whole herd of cattle? Well, they transported them in a cooler because they were all embryos, right? So they transferred a whole herd of cattle in, you know, a couple of coolers and said, oh, here you go. And then they went through the process of implanting the embryos, and bada bing, bada boom, you got American Chinese cattle, right? And even there, you could see, you know, how big beef started becoming in other markets around the world because of American advancements in cattle technology and ranching technology and all that kind of stuff. So ranching was an important factor in the development of the West, and it continues to be a major factor in the economy and technology of the region. So we've talked about ranching, now let's talk about agriculture and farming out in the West. So from the 19th century through the first decades of the 20th century, settlers created farms in the American Trans-Mississippi West. These settlers directed torrents of grain and mountains of meat, hides, wool, and cotton to the markets of the older states and of the world. By their example, they drew millions of hopeful compatriots and immigrants into the American West to share in the adventure of planting European American style settlements. Of course, European Americans were not the first to utilize the agricultural potential of the North American continent or of the American West. Earlier migrants, the Indians, obviously they had come a long time before, had adopted farming practices long before the era of European expansion. Natives of the northeastern woodlands were raising what they called the Three Sisters, corns, bean, and squash, when the Puritans arrived. And the Three Sisters are one of the main agricultural staples of the North American continent. And the reason why they were called the Three Sisters, as you can see on the diagram there, is because they all helped each other grow. The corn provided stability for the beans provided a more structured growth for the corn, and the squash provided nitrogen for both the beans and the corn to grow, and the corn leaves provided a cover for the squash. So they all worked together to grow themselves, and so that's why they were called the Three Sisters, and that's why they were so easily grown together. Even centuries earlier, the Hohokam Indians out in what's modern-day Arizona had tended irrigation canals, and in a lot of the irrigation canals, modern-day Arizonans use more advanced technology along those same irrigation trails. Apache Indians channeled water to their crops in New Mexico during the 1700s. Although some Indian groups depended on hunting, the natives had identified a range of seeds, nuts, roots, bulbs, leaves, and bark, and they used that as food, fiber, and medicine. They sometimes even fostered particular flora by planting seeds or otherwise manipulating the environment to get what they wanted out of the plants. As American settlements expanded, the frontiersmen planted Indian corn and potatoes and squash and beans side by side with more European type plants like wheat, oats, barley, and peas. So you see that confluence of Native American agricultural practices and European agricultural practices start to meld together and create, again, a unique American environment when it came to farming. When the pioneer farmers pushed across the Mississippi during the early 19th century, they understood the major features of the federal land disposal system. Federal surveyors had preceded them, or were soon to follow, leaving a grid of baselines and prime meridians in which to set the ranges of townships. And you can see that surveyed area there on that map, and then even a more localized survey system here, right? So this is a more local survey system where you see the grids and everything, and you could pick out your grid, and that's what you would do if you were a settler in the federal government had already surveyed an area. You would say, I want this grid, or I want this grid. And then you see the much larger survey system of the country as they perpetually moved west, and they surveyed more areas. So the surveyors would come out there and show them all these things about how a township should be laid out, where your water supplies were, things like that. And within the framework of the federal surveys, the settlers would pick out their land and buy out their land. I want these grids, or I want this grid, what have you. Due to the political power of the pioneers, Congress actually loosened up the system, passing preemption, donation, and homestead laws, which made it a lot easier and more affordable and incentivize people going out to the West and getting land. And they even implemented environmental adaptations like timber culture laws and the Desert Land Act of the 1870s to try to help cultivate the environment out there. But the settlers also found many fertile western lands available for purchase only from railroad companies or western states and territories, as well as from reviled land speculators who would go out and buy up all these land and then sell it for a tidy profit, which again is, capitalism at work. But if you're moving out there and you want a good piece of land, you may not have the money to pay for a premium piece of land if a speculator's already come out there and bought up prime property. And of course, we know how the railroads got all of their land. We talked about that earlier, where states and the federal government are just handing them land and saying, here, like Texas giving 32 million acres of land. Well, obviously the railroads didn't use all that land, but they were given that land, and so they end up selling the land as well. Now, between 1820 and 1870, the Hispanic population had their own agrarian frontier. Settlers filtered out from the old Spanish communities developed holdings on streams where they could irrigate patches of grain, corn, beans, peppers, and other vegetables, or in canyons that served as bases for grazing flocks because the canyons could block out wind, keep their crops safe, and usually the canyons had water in it where they could keep their sheep from roaming around or getting eaten by coyotes, and their plants wouldn't get blown away by the wind. When the Americans started to move out there, this frontier expansion was well underway, reflecting population growth and the vitalization of the Southwest economy that occurred after trade relationships had developed in the lower Missouri River Valley. Now, after the Mexican-American War in 1848, the United States Army's efforts to curb the southwestern tribes encouraged the spread of Hispanic farming populations. And by the early 1870s, Spanish-speaking settlers were confronting Texas cattlemen and Mormon farmers, and we get this struggle over who owns what land, who can settle where, who can drive their cattle where, all this kind of stuff. And as Hispanics struggled to hold on to their lands against these aggressive competitors and to contend with small-scale irrigation farming, this frontier kind of lost both its distinctive character and its vitality, but it's still a very strong part of the American Southwest. Even today, large Hispanic farms and ranches are all throughout the Southwest. Now, farm women's work did not stop when she crossed the threshold of her house. Farm women typically worked in the garden, cared for the barnyard animals, milked the cows, churned butter, all those types of things that you see if you go to one of those dopey frontier town things that have reenactors that don't have anything else better to do. And I'm sure some of you do that, and that's fine. But I think all of us took a field trip to one of those things and was just like, oh my gosh. At least I did. And I have a PhD in history, and those things are even tiresome for me. Again, if you do, that's cool. I have friends that do it. I still make fun of them. But hey, I might end up doing it at one point. I'm sure I'll get roped into it at some point. I don't know. Anyway, so the little amount of money or store credit from selling eggs and butter sometimes made the difference between success and failure in these new settlements. Women helped with the binding and shocking of grain in pre-binder days and often drove draft animal teams during harvest time. In matters of domestic economy, there were probably differences depending on the material and cultural circumstances as well as the personal inclinations of the women involved. Some pioneering women found the landscape hostile and the outdoor tasks difficult. Others enjoyed the companionship involved in labor and were thrilled to experience new sights, sounds, smells of their new homelands. Typically, what we find is that it was the immigrant women, especially immigrant women from Scandinavian countries like Norway, Sweden, Finland. They were the ones that really took well to the outdoor life because it was very much like the life that they had in Scandinavia. The ones that typically had the problems with it were middle to upper class women from America, from the East Coast that had moved out to the West because their family hit hard times or they married into, a fourth son of a family or something like that, and their husbands or whatever wanted to make a new life for themselves and would move out west. They were the ones that typically had a harsher time with the West and everything that was done out there. On large, prosperous farms, the farm wife may be supplied with hired help and never really feel the need to venture outside her nice little picket fenced yard. Other cultural groups, like the Scandinavians, the Germans, outdoor work was part of their heritage. So you just kind of see these differences in the individual woman and the individual peoples and their cultures about how they acclimated to the West and the work that was required to survive out there. And of course, as settlements spread into the prairie states, mechanization accelerated. And by 1820, John Wood had developed the prototype for the iron walking plow, where you could, strap it to a team and walk behind it and plow your fields. Now, Wood's plow was an improvement, but the dense prairie grass revealed soils that clogged the iron molds of the plow. So the grass, the prairie grass and all the soil was sticking to the iron. It's just the chemical compounds and the way it worked, they would stick to the iron. And so, yeah, that may be great for a harvest or two, but if you're tearing up all your soil, all your topsoil, that's not good. You're getting rid of all the things that are helping you grow your crops. Well, prairie blacksmiths developed massive beam plows that would help break the sod, and during the 1930s and 40s, a man by the name of John Deere led in manufacturing steel plows. And the steel plows, which did not allow the soils to stick to the plow. So now there's actually debate on whether John Deere actually invented the steel plow or not. Maybe some other people did and he was just better at it. Maybe John Deere and a couple of other people came up with the same idea at the same time. So there's still a little bit of debate on whether John Deere actually invented the steel plow or if he was just the best one to sell it. But I think it would be hard to argue that most Americans don't know what John Deere is. Especially if you live in Texas or any of the prairie states or farming areas, you definitely know John Deere because John Deere is everywhere. So, I mean, in that sense, John Deere was definitely the most successful steel plow salesman if he didn't invent it either way. Other inventions like developers like Cyrus McCormick mechanized the harvest process with new metal-geared cutting machines and the introduction of a marsh harvester in the 1870s that revolutionized the whole harvest process, made it a lot quicker and a lot more efficient with a lot less labor. So a small farm system could buy one of these marsh harvesters and be able to survive much longer than failing and having to go, work for a bigger farm or find new areas to live. Now, of course, those of you that live in the West, and most of you I'm sure do, especially in Texas, it gets really hot. It's really arid, unless you live on like the coast and Houston and things like that, where it's just oppressively humid, right? And there's areas of Texas that are both really dry and then at the same time get really humid, and it's mind-boggling, isn't it? Well, the problem of aridity manifests itself in numerous ways, including home construction and crop yields. The first dwelling of pioneers was typically a log cabin, which settlers in the grassland preferred. Obviously, Lincoln logs and Little House on the Prairie and all that are log cabins and stuff like that. But during the first few months of settlement, some families lived in what we call lean-tos, which is just a little wood shack, or even canvas-covered carts in their wagon boxes. Reason why is there a lot of trees out in the plains? Not really. There's not a whole lot, and the wood is kind of junk. So they had to live with what they could, and they didn't always have log cabins. They couldn't always find the wood to make log cabins. So they would make sod houses. Sod housing was very common. And the walls and usually the roof constructed of rectangles of tough, matted sod. Dugouts scooped from the sides of creeks with walls of sod were common too. So you'd actually be living in a creek bed or a low river bed, things like that. But there were also some frame and stone buildings as well if you could find the materials to do it. Grassland soils were highly productive with an adequate amount of water, but since rainfall diminished in yearly average as farmers moved further west, as you can see from the map there, it definitely gets a lot drier the further you move west. So settlers, when they were moving further west, they had to obtain lower average yields per acre and were forced to cultivate larger land plots to get the same amount of yield out of them. So the uncertainties of plains weather also dictated the work that needed to be done when conditions were favorable. So if you had a good rain or if you had a good stretch of weather, you needed to take advantage of it. And people really watched the weather and tried to predict what the weather would do yearly or monthly or weekly, to try to figure out when was the best time to grow crops, when was the best time to harvest crops, when can we do this, when can we do that. And the weather really drove all of these decisions, and it was much harder to do than it was in the East. We can't talk about the West without talking about Indian tribes and Indian relations and the Indian wars that went on between the United States government and the various Indian tribes of the Western Plains. Now, so to do that, we need to kind of go back a little bit in time to the 1850s to kind of understand how the relationship between the native tribes on the plains and the government started, and compare how the government treated the Indian tribes before the Civil War and after the Civil War in the Gilded Age up until 1900. So we kind of need to know what's going on before and after the Civil War to kind of understand what the policies were during the Gilded Age. So before the Civil War, the United States government tried to get the Indian tribes to sign treaties to protect American settlers while passing through Indian country. The government knew the state of Plains Indians affairs and how important war was to many Plains Indians cultures. The government recognized it had to have all the tribes that it could gather for a treaty, and that it had to show a good faith initiative with the Indians in order to gain any sort of security for Americans crossing the plains. So during this time period in the pre-Civil War era, treaties were used for peaceful purposes to get peaceful results. Now you may be thinking, isn't that what a treaty is for, Dr. Smith, to get peaceful results? You would think, but we're going to see a massive shift after the Civil War with what treaties were going to be used for. But here in the pre-Civil War era, the treaties were used for peaceful purposes to get peaceful results. So let's look at a couple of treaties from the pre-Civil War era so we can see what we're talking about. The first one of these treaties was the Treaty of 1851. And this was one of the first treaties with the Plains Indians that attempted to resolve the growing tension between American troops, settlers, miners, and the Plains Indians tribes, who saw the Americans as a destructive force on their sacred land. So the treaty was attended by the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho tribes in huge numbers, along with contingents of the Crow, Hidatsa, Arikara, and Assiniboine. It is the largest gathering of tribes in the history of the Plains at this Treaty of 1851. The largest gathering of tribes ever in the history of the Plains, before or since. The first article of the Treaty of 1851 called for the Plains Indians to be peaceful and friendly with each other and not go to war with other tribes so as to keep the peace a long-standing one. Anyone who knew the Plains Indians and their culture knew that this was an absurd and almost laughable article. Among the tribes present at the meeting here at Fort Laramie, there were 100 ongoing intertribal wars that had been fought for as long as 200 or 300 years. Right? So yeah, it's this huge gathering. Oh, great, we have all these people here. And there's 100 ongoing intertribal wars going on between all of those groups there. And then they come to say, hey guys, could you not fight each other? That'd be great. And they're all sitting there going, yeah, sure, we're not going to do that. So you may be thinking, if this was the case, why did all these Indian tribes show up to begin with? Well, the only reason many of the tribes even came to the meeting was because of the advice of a few influential Americans on the plains that had great sway with the tribal chiefs. The only reason the influential Americans talked to the chiefs about coming to the meeting was the government was paying them to help bring people to the treaty. The treaty also offered the Indians protection and material gains in exchange for the right to create boundaries, forts, and roads. The government promised to repay the Indians for any damage caused by American settlers, but said that the Great Father, the president or the government, could establish military forts and that the Indians would have certain boundaries. The boundaries would be based on traditional lands and was not to be seen as taking of land, but as a way to kind of create some responsibility, some accountability here. So for example, if something happened in a particular area, the tribe living there would bear the responsibility unless they could prove another tribe committed the crime. Right? So say something happens in Arikara country. Well, like somebody gets murdered in Arikara country. Right? Well, the Arikara would be on the hook for that, unless they could show, well, this wasn't us, this was one of the Cheyenne that did it. And then the responsibility would be shifted to the Cheyenne. And there you can see the map there of what the Sioux area would look like. And then, of course, you see, Crow, Cheyenne, Arikara, Pawnee, Hidatsa, all those other tribes around in their areas outside of the Sioux territory. So in that area, the Sioux would be responsible for whatever happened in that area unless they could say, well, it was the Arikara or the Crow that did this crime or did whatever. Now, the treaty was broken, and who do you think broke it first? The U.S. Army. The U.S. Army broke the treaty first when they tried to illegally arrest a Sioux warrior, and the Sioux, in turn, killed about 30 men in the U.S. Army's arresting party. Whoops. So, yeah, the U.S. Army illegally broke the treaty, but the Sioux also slaughtered 30 of the guys, too. It doesn't look good on either side. Let's put it that way, right? So, but that's what's overall though. The treaty is working. It's doing what it should, and you just have dopes that do things because people are dumb, right? But overall, it's actually a pretty successful treaty. So they see, wow, this is such a great and successful treaty. Let's try to do this with Indians in the Southwest. And so that brings about the Treaty of 1852. And this treaty involved Magnus Coloradus of the Southwest Apache tribe. Now, the government did not fulfill the language of the treaty because it failed to ratify the treaty on time. All right, so they promised all these things. Essentially, it was almost a carbon copy of the Treaty of 1851 that they took to the Southwest Apache, and they promised the Apache all of these things like they did with all the Plains Indians. And the main leader of the Apache, Magnus Coloradus, agreed to this. Well, when the Senate doesn't ratify it in a timely manner, the non-ratification led to Magus's Apaches raiding and living off the land because the promises of food and supplies from the treaty never arrived. So a government agent in charge of Apache relations even got most of the Apache warriors to settle down and start farming. And that is a crazy thing to get the Apaches to do, especially Apache warriors, because in Apache culture, farming was seen as woman's work. That's what the women did, was the farming. Men went out and did the hunting and the war making. Women did the farming and the housekeeping, right? So the fact that this agent was able to get these Apache warriors to go against their cultural norms and start farming was a big deal. And he got them to do this until 1858. So for about 5 or 6 years, he got them to do this, but the treaty was still not ratified by then. None of the promises of the treaty had been met, which led Magnus and to believe that they never would be met. And he led his tribe on more raids and looting missions. And Mangus ravaged the countryside. He brought forces against many and any American settlers that he found. Miners, supply trains, ranches, government agents, anywhere he could find them. Right? Now, Magnus Coloradus continued his hatred towards the United States government until he was captured and killed in 1863. So, Magnus Coloradus was promised all these things, and when he wasn't given to him, he said, oh, okay, well, if you're not going to fill your end of the bargain, neither am I, and I'm going to go raid everything and kill everything. And he was so angry with the United States government that it didn't matter if those people were innocent, if they were on his land or not. If he came across anybody he even suspected was an American, they were dead. Right? So we see how it was kind of successful, or fairly successful, with the Plains Indians, but the government's inaction with the Treaty of 1852 led to a lot more violence and hatred with the Apache Indians in the Southwest. Well, immediately following the Civil War, the U.S. Army was reduced drastically and spread thin over the plains and Reconstruction South. The Army's main job on the plains was to protect American settlers traveling on the trail through Indian country, while the government was trying to figure out a new policy and strategy on how to deal with growing Indian hostilities, and we can kind of see, well, maybe that, maybe there's a reason why these hostilities are growing. Now, the difficulty of a thin army plus the increase in American settlers traveling through Indian country on trails and railroads made the Army's job of defending against Indian attacks all the more difficult. Despite all of the troubles with the Indians and formulating an Indian policy, the government was not ready to embark on another war of annihilation similar to the Civil War. And the reason why, it's a war of annihilation against the Confederates, which is what they essentially fought in the Civil War, meant the destruction of the intangible Confederate government, like the intangible idea of the Confederacy, right? That's what the war of annihilation was being waged on, was the Confederacy, right? But a war of annihilation against the Indians meant the death of a tangible race of people, and that's much different. And after the Civil War, the government is going to try to use treaties as opposed to a war of annihilation. But instead of using those treaties for peaceful purposes and have peaceful treaties for those peaceful purposes, instead they're going to use these treaties to take away Indian freedoms, force them onto reservations, and provide for them when they had no intention to do so. And those of you that took me in US 1, this maybe kind of reminds you of the early 1830s with the Indian Removal Act and Cherokee Nation v. Georgia and Worcester v. Georgia, and how the Supreme Court had said, no, the Indians have rights. This is how they have rights as people in America. This is their relation to the federal government. And it seems here, 30 years later, that the government is essentially did what Jackson did and ignored the Supreme Court's rulings and said, I don't know if they really have rights or not. And so we see this drastic change of, we're going to use these treaties as implementations of peace. Instead, we're going to use these treaties as an implementation of control. And that's going to be the big difference between pre-Civil War conditions and treaties with the Indians and post-Civil War relations and treaties with the Indians. The U.S. Army made matters worse than what they were when it started to build a new fort, a fort called Fort Phil Kearny in Lakota Sioux territory. Now, when we say Lakota Sioux, the Sioux as a tribe were divided up into three major groups: the Lakota, the Nakota, and the Dakota, right? So L, N, and D, right? But the largest of this group and more famous is the Lakota. And the Army is building this fort, Fort Phil Kearny, in Lakota Sioux territory. Now, this violated some of the pre-existing treaties and worsened debate between Sioux tribes about what the future of what their future should be. Do we move on to government encampments that they've been telling us and that we should do? Or should we resist removal from our land? One of the prominent de facto leaders of the Sioux was a man by the name of Crazy Horse. Crazy Horse was a Lakota Sioux who was part of the Oglala subset of the Lakota. So he's an Oglala Sioux. And he was a much respected leader and warrior among not only the Sioux tribes, but all Plains Indians tribes and the U.S. Army. And he wanted to resist removal and took action against it. Now, Crazy Horse is one of those guys that just kind of lives on in legend, and a lot of myth and lore surround Crazy Horse. And if you do a Google image search of Crazy Horse, all sorts of people will come up and you're like, well, which one's Crazy Horse? And photos of this and that will be labeled Crazy Horse. None of those are correct. None of those are correct. Crazy Horse never, ever had his picture taken. He never had a painting of him done. Crazy Horse believed that photographs and paintings would capture some of his soul and he couldn't get it back. And actually, a lot of Native Americans believed that it was robbing something from you. And so he never had his picture taken, never had his picture painted. So if you ever see any of those, that didn't happen. Those are falsely labeled. He was a very unique guy when it came to the Sioux and their culture. Not only personality-wise, but physically. Physically, he almost looked white. In fact, many white settlers thought that he was white, especially when he was a child. They thought he was a little white boy. He had sandy brownish hair. He had a very light complexion, and his hair was kind of curly. In fact, his name when he was first born was Curly. They called him Curly because he had curly hair. He didn't earn the name Crazy Horse until later. And he was a very quiet, very shy kind of guy until you got him out on the battlefield, and then he was an amazing warrior. But in camp and when war wasn't going on, he was very reserved. He didn't really take part in dancing and singing. He was very reserved. The only time people ever said he really smiled or really interacted with other fellow Sioux was around children. He was always very, laughing and playing with the kids if they came up to him and was like, "Oh, Crazy Horse, come play with us." He would do that. So he was nice to kids, but to people older or whatever, he was very quiet, very very reserved, and yet extremely respected for his prowess on a horse and for his prowess on the battlefield. Which is a very rare thing in Plains Indians cultures, for him to have that kind of personality around camp and then be so respected as a leader because of the way he was on the battlefield. Obviously, the battlefield was important, but things like oratory, your dance, your singing, like all of those things would go to your credibility in your leadership roles. And he was so good on the battlefield and such a good tactician that he could be a kind of quiet guy and everybody still respect him and be like, "Oh, that's Crazy Horse, that's Crazy Horse," and everybody knew who he was. So what he wanted to do carried a lot of weight with a lot of people. And so what he wanted to do is he wanted to resist. And the Sioux start gathering other Indian tribes in the plains to try to talk about, okay, what are we going to do? Like, they're building this in our territory, but if they build it in our territory, they can build it in yours as well. So the Sioux went to the Cheyenne, and the Sioux and Cheyenne leaders decided on a plan that consisted of a combined force of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors that would harass the fort for a few weeks while it was being constructed, before drawing out a larger contingent of soldiers that they could lead away from the fort to an open meadow between two places called Lodge Trail Ridge and Prairie Dog Creek. And then they could ambush the soldiers out of sight of the fort's main forces, because there's a lot of ridges and valleys and stuff in the area that they're in. Well, the leaders liked Crazy Horse's ideas of using a large force to draw out the soldiers, that they would feign a retreat, and a smaller group that would appear after the larger group retreated to act as decoys to lure the U.S. soldiers to the killing fields, where they planned on launching their ambush. And the council of all these leaders appointed another Sioux, Red Cloud. There's Red Cloud there on the left. That he actually had his picture taken and everything. Red Cloud was appointed as a leader of the large group, and Crazy Horse was picked to be the leader of the decoys. It was Crazy Horse's plan, so they said, "Crazy Horse, you're the leader of the decoys." And Crazy Horse and Red Cloud planned this together, so they obviously were the obvious choices to be the leadership. It was just who was going to do what. Well, Crazy Horse's appointment as leader of the decoys ignited the warriors of all the tribes. And they hurried to actually put in their names as volunteers to be one of the other 9 decoys in this. So there's going to be 10 decoys total. Obviously, Crazy Horse was going to be one of them, so there was 9 spots. They all rushed to be in that decoy group. Now, this is essentially could possibly be a suicide mission. And because Crazy Horse is leading it, all of these warriors sign up to be volunteers. In fact, so many of them signed up and wanted to be in this group, they essentially had tryouts for this group because they wanted to ride and fight with Crazy Horse. In the end, out of the 10, 8 or 7 end up being Sioux warriors, 2 Cheyennes, and 1 Arapaho. Now, some of the sources kind of conflict as to how many went and who was what and all this kind of stuff. But the best sources that we have say there were 10, 7 Sioux, 2 Cheyenne, and an Arapaho. So all the big tribes are represented at least in the group. So they have their plan that the large group led by Red Cloud's going to come in and they're going to, all of the groups are going to harass the fort for a couple of weeks to really try to piss them off and piss them off to the point that whenever the time was right, they were going to enact their plan. They figured it would take about 2 weeks to really piss off the soldiers enough to where the soldiers will come out en masse and follow them, and then they could kill a large contingent of them. That's what they kind of figured on, right? So they have their groups, they've had their tryouts, so everybody knows what their roles are. And Crazy Horse and Red Cloud put their plan into action on December 6th, 1866, when they sent a small force to attack a group of woodcutters that had come out from the fort. Remember, they're still kind of building the fort and everything. They need wood. So some woodcutters are out, from the fort and chopping wood. Well, they go in and start harassing the woodcutters, and the fort's commanding officer sent a man by the name of Captain William Fetterman out to rescue the woodcutters. Well, a small skirmish ensued. 3 U.S. soldiers end up dead before the alliance of the Indian groups withdraws from the battlefield. Now, the Indian forces continually raided the fort's construction site for the next 2 weeks in an effort to frustrate the soldiers. And the plan totally worked. Totally worked. And no trooper became more irritated than William Fetterman. He's beside himself. He can't believe that the Indians are getting away with this. Now, Fetterman was a Civil War veteran, and he was confident in his fighting prowess and boasted that all he needed was 80 men, 80 men, and he could destroy the entire Sioux Nation with 80 men. That he could destroy the entire Sioux Nation with 80 men. So he's pretty confident. He's pretty confident in himself there. So you can see why he's getting really frustrated over these 2 weeks when these little small groups of Sioux and Cheyenne and Arapaho start coming over and harassing him and doing all this kind of stuff. And he's getting really pissed. But his commanding officer is not saying, hey, you need to go out and take care of this. He's just saying, hey, go rescue the woodcutters, go rescue the supply guys, do whatever. Well, Crazy Horse and Red Cloud are sensing the army is getting ready for a fight. So the Sioux leaders enacted the second part of their plan. So Crazy Horse led the group of 10 decoys to draw out the soldiers out into the open and entice them on a wild goose chase away from the fort. Once the troops followed the decoys over a ridge, the combined Indian force would ambush them. All right. So we're going to have the large group come in and do their harassment and then withdraw. And when the troops think that they're gone, then Crazy Horse and his 10 men are going to show up, possibly looking like, guys left behind, or maybe that they're still closer enough that they can attack and try to draw them out to where the larger group has now gone, and they can ambush them. All right? So, Now, the fort sent out a wagon train to cut wood on December 21st. Now, you know, those woodcutters, after 2 weeks of this, are going, I don't want to go, man. Come on. You know, the commanding officer was having to tell guys, hey, you go, that's an order. Because they're like, I don't want to get attacked. Come on. Have you seen what's going on the past 2 weeks? Right? But, I mean, somebody's got to go cut wood. So they go out with the wagon train and all this kind of stuff on December 21st. Well, of course, Crazy Horse and Red Cloud and the rest of the Indians attack it. Well, the commanding officer, I don't think said his name. His name's Carrington. Carrington put Fetterman in charge of the rescue party, as usual. But he gave Fetterman strict orders to rescue the men and come back. Carrington told Fetterman that under no circumstances was he to pursue the Indians if they fled away from the fort. See, Carrington's smart. He knows that the Indians are trying to goad them into an ambush, right? He realizes this is what's going on. He sees the frustration, he sees the fear in his guys' eyes, and he knows that the Indians could have attacked them much bigger. Like, Carrington knows what's up. That's probably why he's a commanding officer, right? And he tells Fetterman, do not chase them. Whatever you do, do not chase them. You may see where this is going. So, the rescue party consisted of 50 infantrymen, 27 cavalrymen, and Fetterman. There were no experienced Indian fighters amongst those 50 infantrymen, those 27 cavalrymen. None. 2 civilians volunteered to go out with the soldiers. 2. They were, well, maybe contractors or just, camp followers, what have you. And I guess they were tired of the harassment or thought that they could help. And so those 2 civilians go as well. Well, if you're a math major, you've been doing your math. It's 50 infantrymen, 27 cavalrymen, Fetterman, and now 2 civilians. What does that add up to? Oh, that adds up to 80. Okay. That brings the rescue party's total to 80. It seems as though fate had told Fetterman to put up or shut up with his grand claims of fighting superiority against the Sioux Nation. Okay. Well, when the rescue party arrived at the scene, Red Cloud ordered his men to retreat. Just like the plan said, the larger group retreats and Red Cloud leads them to the ambush site. Now, the decoys allowed the rescue party to pass their hiding spot before attacking while the main attacking force withdrew from the field. Now, the decoys had to make sure the rescue party followed them the entire 5 miles over snow-covered ridges and fields to the prepared ambush site. So they got to follow them for 5 miles. Got to make sure, hey, come on, you got to follow us, right? Fetterman's chance at glory seemed to disappear when Red Cloud and his group disappeared over some of the ridges in their retreat. Well, then guess who shows up? That's right. He sees Crazy Horse, and Crazy Horse and the 9 other decoys rode into sight. Captain Fetterman, sensing his opportunity and realizing the wagon train was safe, ordered his men to fire and pursue Crazy Horse's group. He went against direct orders. The decoys taunted the soldiers and feigned injuries to their horses to keep them in pursuit. Across all these ridges and snow-covered fields. One decoy stopped his horse, turned around, stood on the horse's back, and acted as though he was watching a show that the soldiers were putting on for him. He was sitting there clapping like, yeah, all right, yeah, look at these guys putting on a show for me. Right? And so, of course, it draws the fire, and they're firing at him, and he, flips around and gets back on his horse and starts riding. Others, sensing that the Americans were about to turn back, would charge the soldiers to draw their fire and give them hope that they were on the verge of catching the decoys. Crazy Horse at one point stopped his horse, calmly got off, coolly whipped out his knife, and started scraping the ice off of his horse's hooves. Bullets are flying by him, and he's just like, yep, gotta get this ice off this horse's hoof. He did this obviously to help his horse, but also to entice the soldiers to keep following. And it worked. It worked. The soldiers hurried their pursuit, and once the whizzing bullets came closer to him, Crazy Horse jumped on his horse and headed towards the ambush site. Now, they got over this last main ridge, and they were saying, oh yeah, come on, you can get us, we're just right over here on this other side of the ridge, right? And once the decoys cleared that Lodge Trail ridge, they harassed the soldiers some more with some more gunfire. But when it looked like the army was about to come over the crest of that ridge, the decoys sped off. But the decoys formed two straight lines, right? And 5 on one side, 5 on the other, right? And they're running in a sprint. They have their horses sprinting in straight lines. And then, when they saw that the soldiers were coming over the ridge, the two lines ran intersecting patterns across each other. They did essentially X's across each other. All right? So they're X patterning across each other. That was the sign to attack. The combined forces of Crazy Horse and Red Cloud slaughtered Fetterman's group. All of them, as far as we know, died. The entire ordeal, from the time Fetterman arrived at the wagon train to the last U.S. soldier falling dead, lasted 30 minutes. That's it. 30 minutes. That's all it took. The incident is known as a couple of things. To the Indian nations, it's known as the Battle of the 100 in the Hand. To some people, it's called the Fetterman Massacre. Other ones, it's called the Battle of Fort Phil Kearny. Others, it's known as the Fetterman Defeat. It has a lot of names. But what latched on in America, and especially in the East, was, of course, the more sensationalized Fetterman Massacre. It was a massacre. But clearly it was not a massacre in the traditional sense. But the Fetterman Massacre finally broke the government's will to continue war making against the Sioux, but only for a short amount of time. But Fetterman had his chance. He had his 80. He said he could take out the entire Sioux Nation. Well, that didn't work out there for old Bill Fetterman there, huh? Now, Red Cloud predicted that a decisive victory against a large army force, blocking of western trails, and constant guerrilla attacks against the forts would prove to be too much for the government to bear. And he was correct. He was correct. Now, Civil War General William Tecumseh Sherman, who is now in charge of the armies in the West, pushed Congress for immediate reprisals against the Plains tribes. But Congress received reports from fort commanders about the constant attacks and the blockage of trails, which in turn drove up the prices to ship cargo across the continent because, more dangerous means more money, and made it difficult for the army to find contractors willing to work in those conditions. Right? Because, of course, it's being reported that those 2 civilians were killed as well. Well, are they reporting that they went out with the group and stuff? Maybe, maybe not. Congress organized a peace commission to send to the Sioux leaders in an effort to end this war, right? And you can see, that's what Fort Phil Kearny looked like. And this, I know it's kind of tough to kind of read this map, but this is what the army says. This is what their recreation of the battle would have been, right? And so it's kind of hard to fail. You see, Lodge Trail Ridge there, right? You see it right here. And, the decoy retreat of the Indians coming over here, right? And essentially this is where that all happened, right? So that's what they thought had happened, right? So they try to come to a treaty or something to do with the Indians in the war, but this was a great victory for Crazy Horse, Red Cloud, and the alliance of the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho. So, following year, in 1867, the government is still trying to stay away from a strategy of annihilation. So, to stay away from that, the government formed something called the Peace Committee in 1867 to deal with the Indians on a more conniving diplomatic level. All right? So they're still not saying we need to destroy them, but they are saying, well, we may not need to destroy them, but we should at least deceive them. Right? And of course, they call it the Peace Committee. Right? Because you're thinking a Peace Committee is going to, try to be honest, and that's kind of why they named it the Peace Committee. Well, the Medicine Lodge Treaty in 1867 was one of the first treaties drawn up under the government's new ruthless diplomatic policy. All right? This is one of the first major treaties done with this new ideology of what the treaty should be for. All right? Remember we talked about the pre- and post-Civil War stuff. Well, the Medicine Lodge Treaty is one of those where it's definitely not for peaceful purposes. So Congress set up the Peace Commission on June 30th, 1867. And the purpose of this Peace Commission or Peace Committee, whichever, it's kind of referred to as both, but it's usually called the Peace Commission, was to get the Indians to agree to 3 compromises. Okay, so that's the purpose of the Peace Commission, is 3 compromises to get out of the Plains Indian tribes. First, to abolish all Indian wars and remove anything that may cause a war. Okay, we saw that one earlier, and we know how foolish that one is. But that's one of their things: abolish all Indian wars and anything that could cause a war. Okay, that already seems like a tall order. 2, to keep the Indians from disturbing railroad construction across the plains and from attacking American settlers on the frontier. That's all part of 2. So essentially keep them from attacking the railroads, keep them from attacking settlers. And then 3, to turn the Indian tribes from nomadic tribesmen into farmers. That's probably the most difficult one out of all of them, because they're not a farming group of people. They're nomadic tribesmen. They move around. They follow the buffalo herds. They're not agriculturally minded, at least not in a this is our area, this is where we're going to farm type of mentality. So, if Congress and the Peace Commission wanted to stop the Indian raids, they would have agreed to stop building railroads and letting settlers continue into the West. But they had no intention to stop what they saw was progress. So that should give you a lesson here of one man's progress is another man's regression. Right? I mean, do you think the Indian tribe saw this as progress? No. But the American government is like, this is progress of the country, we're not going to let anything stop it. So, of course, that chip, that bargaining chip, that compromise chip is gone already because they weren't willing to compromise on that kind of stuff. Now, the attitude of the Peace Commission as well as the United States people can be summed up best by General Sherman, when he told a group of Indians, and I quote, "You cannot stop the locomotive any more than you can stop the sun or the moon, and you must submit and do the best that you can. And if you continue fighting, you will all be killed." Whoa. There's no really interpreting that one, is there? That's pretty straightforward. Of course, Sherman was a very straightforward guy, especially those of you that took me US 1 definitely know about Sherman's tendencies there, don't we? So the Madison Lodge Treaty also provided for a drastic shift in policy from pre-Civil War treaties. The reservation, right? So the Madison Lodge Treaty is the first treaty to introduce the Indian reservation. When the United States government had banished the Indians of the East to lands beyond the Mississippi, they were given land, but they weren't necessarily confined to the land by set boundaries. They were just like, this is your land if you want to settle on it, but you can roam, but you can't settle in these other areas because you're a Choctaw and that's Cherokee land. You can't settle on that land unless you have Cherokee permission, blah, blah, blah. You can walk around, do whatever you want. You won't be confined to the land, but you can't settle in certain lands, right? Unless you have permission. Well, this is saying, no, you will be confined to this reservation. So, the government is making it a policy to confine the Indians in small areas away from their ancestral lands. Of course, this is a complete change in policy from the agreements the government brought to the table with the Treaty of 1851. The reason the Indians did not know the consequences of the treaty was because the Peace Commission told the interpreter not to translate everything. And what the interpreter did translate was vague at best. Now, the Treaty of Laramie in 1868 is a perfect example of the government trying to keep the Indians in the dark just so they can say they accomplished something. The Peace Commission saw that one of the major causes of Indian raids were the army forts along certain rivers. Gee, I wonder why. The Treaty of Laramie, according to the government, would end this problem and appease Plains Indians because the government felt that they were not asking for anything in return from the Indians. So they felt like this was super easy. We're not even asking anything from you. So here's what the treaty called for. The Sioux to settle in a reservation in a barren area with no wild game and to become farmers. The treaty also required the Sioux to submit to a census and to allow the government to build railroads and wagon trails through sacred Sioux land and hunting grounds. So they're not asking much at all, are they? Okay, sure, right? Just give up your way of life, give up your ancestral lands, live in this barren area with no game, and be a farmer. Yeah, we're not asking much. That's not much. What are you complaining about? It's ridiculous. But because many of the clauses were not accurately translated, if at all, many of the chiefs signed the document without knowing the true consequences of what they had just agreed to, including Red Cloud. Red Cloud signed this treaty and didn't know what it said. That should be also another lesson to you, kids. Don't sign something unless you understand it. The Indian chiefs were in Washington, D.C. on a diplomatic trip when the problem came up, and the treaty was finally fully translated to the chiefs. Some sympathetic people found this treaty and said, oh my gosh, there's no way they agreed to this. And they read it to the chiefs while they were there. The chiefs obviously cried foul, saying they would never have agreed to such promises, and they demanded to go back to the plains at once. Red Cloud even demanded that no more roads be built and a fort be dismantled within their territory. Now, the president at this time is Ulysses S. Grant, the Civil War general. Grant met with Red Cloud, and when Red Cloud told him all this stuff, Grant advised Red Cloud, go start plowing. You're wasting valuable time, and your crop may not come in if you don't start soon. And then he turned his back on him. Oh, God! That's insane. Ugh, that isn't a fuck you, I don't know what is. However, when gold was found on the Sioux Reservation in the Black Hills, the government reverted back to treaties predating the Treaty of Laramie to say that Americans could come and take and occupy Indian territory, something the Treaty of Laramie forbade. The government had to revert to this action when the Sioux would not sell the Black Hills to speculators, because the Black Hills were a sacred, holy site for many of the Indian tribes, especially the Sioux. So the government ordered the army to protect miners and settlers and illegally occupy the land, knowing the Sioux had no recourse against them. Of course, the government found it easy to go back on their word and reinterpret the language of a long-lost treaty rather than enforce the side of the Treaty of Laramie that benefited the Indians and not the United States. And that's what it's going to happen from here on out, is that they're going to enforce this section of the treaty, but not this section. And they'll go back to these other treaties that supposedly have no force and be like, oh no, they still have force. It's not like they went away, and we're going to enforce this and this, but we're not going to keep our promises from this, this, and this, and this, and this. So you see, that's a stark change in what was meant to happen. They went into this knowing that they were going to do this kind of stuff. Unlike pre-Civil War stuff, where they genuinely believed that they would do this kind of stuff, at least the people doing the treaties. Now, like with the Treaty of 1852, it wasn't those Indian agents' fault that the Senate didn't approve the treaties and do what they wanted. Like that, they operated in good faith at that point. This is clearly not acting in good faith with the Indian tribes at this point, and we're going to see that continue. Well, the Indians aren't going to take this lying down, much like Magnus Coloradus didn't take it laying down. The Sioux, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, all of these tribes are not going to take it lying down either. So after all of the tensions and everything coming from the treaties, there's a few years of calmness before, in the mid-1870s, we get the Great Sioux War. The Great Sioux War was a series of battles and negotiations between 1876 and 1877 that involved the Sioux and the Cheyenne against the United States government. So it really should be called the Great Sioux and Cheyenne War, but I guess that gets a little wordy, so they just call it the Great Sioux War because the Sioux were the bigger portion of this war. The cause of the war was the desire of the government to own the Black Hills, to actually own it, as opposed to trying to break these treaties and do all this kind of stuff. Because technically the Sioux still owned it, but then the treaty said that the government could go onto it. Well, the government's trying to own the Black Hills, right? And remember, that's the area of sacred and holy ground for the Sioux tribes and for many of the Plains tribes as well. Of course, gold was discovered in them Nar Hills there in the Black Hills, and the settlers began to come on to Sioux and Cheyenne lands. The tribes refused to give up ownership of the land. And that led over this course between 1868 and 1876, this 8-year period of constant going back and forth until finally it erupts into a war. And of course, there was various attempts at negotiations and all this kind of stuff, but clearly they failed. The most famous battle of the Great Sioux War is the Battle of Little Bighorn. Now, the Battle of Little Bighorn is both famous and infamous in American history and popular culture. It has obtained almost an Alamo-like status among many Americans who remember the battle as Custer's Last Stand, which brings to mind a group of heroic men led by their long blonde-haired leader George Custer, fighting off hordes of angry Indians until they fell where they stood. The symbols of American modernity temporarily stopped in the face of the barbaric Indian way of life. At least that's how it's been portrayed in American culture and American society, in movies and in dime store novels and television and all this kind of stuff. Okay, that's what American legend has told us. Let's see what actually really kind of happened here now. So let's talk a little bit about George Custer himself. So the legend of him having long, thick, blonde hair is totally true. I know, obviously, you can't tell in the picture because it's black and white, but he had this very distinctive blonde hair, and he, kept it long and it was really thick, and so you knew it was Custer whenever you saw the hair. And he had apparently these very piercing blue eyes that made him stand out during his time, and you can kind of see that in the picture. His irises are very clear. It was very clear blue piercing eyes. People also described it as kind of icy. But for a while, his appearance was all he had going for him in his early years. He graduated dead last in his class at West Point in 1861. But remember, 1861, what's happening? Yeah, the Civil War. But he proved his mettle as a soldier during the Civil War. So I guess all the book learning wasn't for him. But he proved his worth as a soldier, because even though he graduated dead last, it's the Civil War. They need officers out there to actually be leading men. So at least he's had the training. Maybe he was in a great class, and I don't know. But either way, he proved himself in the war. The one characteristic that made Custer stand out among his peers was his courage, seen by some as brave and others as kind of foolhardy. Custer's personality, coupled with his distinguished appearance, led him to becoming a Union icon. And he earned the nickname the Boy General, because, all the, quote unquote cool generals of the Civil War were all Southern generals. And the Union really didn't have their iconic general because Lincoln kept changing them out and all this kind of stuff. So now they kind of have their iconic general that they can all kind of rally behind this boy general. Then the Civil War saw Custer settle into a permanent ranking at lieutenant colonel of the newly formed 7th Cavalry. It's with the cavalry, more so than the Civil War, that Custer showed his brilliance as a leader and tactician. 7th Cavalry was successful in its campaigns against the Southern Plains Indians from 1867 to 1871, but not without controversy surrounding Custer and his action. He was court-martialed for a variety of violations in 1867. So that should tell you something. He was court-martialed for his actions out on the plains during that time period. So that should tell you he's probably not doing some great things if even the Army's like, whoa, dude, like, you need to chill out on the Indians a little bit. He was found guilty without criminality, whatever that means, and suspended for 1 year without pay. The Army reinstated Custer in November of 1868. That same month, he led the 7th to a major victory against the Southern Cheyenne at the Battle of the Washita River, which many historians also call a massacre. And that was a true massacre. The 7th Cavalry murdered old women and children and old men, and it was bad. It was bad. But they didn't court-martial them for that. Now, that was a true massacre. The Fetterman Massacre, we've kind of seen, man, that's not really, that's a little editorialized. The massacre at the Washita was truly a massacre. So, we talked about how the Northern Plains Indians allied with each other against Fort Phil Kearny earlier. But these alliances amongst the Plains Indians hardly lasted longer than a few months, much less years. The alliance between the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho had run its course earlier, and now the Army was bearing down on the Cheyenne, while the Peace Commission was trying to deal with the stubborn Sioux, who are now led by a different chief named Sitting Bull. And there's Sitting Bull. Sitting Bull had his picture taken. Sitting Bull was from a group of Sioux called the Hunkpapa. Right? So remember, Crazy Horse was from the Oglala. Sitting Bull is from the Hunkpapa Sioux. And Sitting Bull became the leader of the Sioux after Red Cloud had relented and moved to a reservation. So Red Cloud actually moved a lot of his Sioux to the Red Cloud Reservation. This is also called the Red Cloud Agency as well. And so Sitting Bull becomes the kind of de facto leader of the Sioux. Now you may be thinking, where's Crazy Horse? I thought he was with Red Cloud. Is he at the Red Cloud Reservation? What's Crazy Horse doing? Don't worry. Crazy Horse joined with Sitting Bull, and he's out with Sitting Bull fighting with Sitting Bull. All right? Now, the Army had issued a standing order for Sitting Bull and the rest of the Sioux to be on a reservation by January 31st, 1876. Well, February 1st, 1876 rolled around, what do you think was going on? Yeah, Sitting Bull and the Sioux were definitely not on that reservation come February 1st. So when the Sioux were still not on that reservation, the army pursued them across the plains and eventually came across them at the Little Bighorn River. Like I said earlier, that is definitely a picture of Sitting Bull. Now this other picture that you see here, that is a monument for Crazy Horse. That's the Crazy Horse Memorial. And it's supposed to be as big as Mount Rushmore or bigger. It's enormous, right? I mean, to give you an idea of just the enormity of this thing right here, this little tiny thing is, I believe, a bulldozer or a dump truck. One of the two. So that should tell you how big this thing is, right? Now this is what it's supposed to, like, if you go to the visitor center, this is what the monument's supposed to look like at some point. That's what it currently looks like. Yeah, I'm sure hopefully it's a little further along than this picture. But that's what it's supposedly going to look like. And I told you the ironic thing is this is supposed to be a Crazy Horse memorial, and we have no idea what he physically looked like. So essentially they're just carving a generic Indian face into that and being like, oh, that's a Crazy Horse. Which is probably isn't, because like we said, his features were a lot different than most other Sioux, so, you know, whatever. Oh, I also don't think I mentioned how Crazy Horse got his name. We talked about how he was curly and all that kind of stuff. So how did he get the name Crazy Horse? Well, Crazy Horse was actually his grandfather's name and then his father's name. And you know, I guess they didn't have Crazy Horse, you know, senior, junior, the third, or anything like that. It's kind of a passing along type name where the father would take another name and then the son would be Crazy Horse. That's kind of how they pass down names in sometimes like that. Right? Well, our Crazy Horse, you know, when he was called Curly or Light Hair, or, you know, things like that, he proved himself. You know, there's a couple of different stories about how he got the name. I'll just tell you my favorite and the one that I think is probably the most likely. So apparently there was a couple of horses or a horse that they had rustled up, feral horses, Mustang type horses, that there was a couple that none of them could break. And our Crazy Horse, being, you know, in his, you know, early adolescence, was able to break a couple of these horses. And these horses were seen as like literally crazy. They would buck people off and whatever, but for whatever reason, they succumbed to the adolescent Crazy Horse. Other people said that he earned it in battle. Others said he did, you know, this and that or whatever. But that's what I tend to think, is that it was actually something with the group of Mustang horses. And his father and everybody was so impressed that his father said, he is now Crazy Horse. I passed that name on to him. He is now Crazy Horse. In the Sioux language and Lakota language, the name Crazy Horse is pronounced Sunkewitko. And there's the Siouxian languages have a kind of cadence to it, so it'd be Sunkewitko, like that. And that translates, well, we say Crazy Horse, and they would probably translate it as Crazy Horse, but it literally means his horse is crazy. Which that's why I think it kind of leads credence to him breaking some wild horses at a very young age. But anyway, so that's how Crazy Horse takes that name. His father apparently takes the name Worm in Sioux. I don't know why he took the name Worm, but at least I hope it's like Big Worm or something like that. But it's just Worm. I don't really know why he took Worm, or what the significance of Worm was, but that's what we got. His father named himself Worm after that. So there you go. So, okay. So we got our new leadership. We got the American Army being led by Custer and the 7th Cavalry. We have the Sioux being led by Sitting Bull, and they came across each other at the Little Bighorn River. So, as you can see from the map, that's where the Battle of the Little Bighorn took place, there in southern Montana on the border of modern-day Montana and Wyoming. You can see where Custer came from before he came across where they were. And of course, you can see that's where the Sioux reservation is where they're supposed to be, and clearly they're not on that reservation yet, right? So, okay, so how does Custer essentially take a straight line and take a beeline from the fort to where they are? Here's how. Rival Crow and Arikara scouts led Custer to the gathering of the Cheyenne and the Sioux, who were discussing a new alliance to take on the army. So it was rival Indian groups that helped the army take out, or at least go try to battle the Sioux and the Cheyenne. You got to remember is that the Native American tribes saw themselves not only as different tribes, but as different people, different races. They're not the same. All right? They don't really see themselves as the same people. Whereas the American government saw them as one. And that causes problems. When your enemy sees you as one and you see yourselves as several, you're going to have a bad time. And it's very easy to use one group to take out the other, and then once all those other groups are taken out, who do you take out next? The ones that helped you, right? And that's kind of what happens here. But of course, they don't see that happening. They think they have an alliance with the, all this kind of stuff. So, now, the scouts told Custer that there were only about 300 warriors among the gathering and that most were women and children. What the scouts failed to do was go one more ridge over in the valley and notice the remaining 5,000 warriors assembled there. So Custer is under the impression that there are only a few hundred warriors in the Indian camp and was confident his 300 men could take the Indians out with ease. So he makes his first mistake. Well, his first mistake is overconfidence. I guess his second mistake would be he split his men into 3 groups of 100. He didn't keep them all together. So, huge mistake, especially after the mistake in scouting. So I guess that's his third mistake. Crazy Horse first learned of American troop movements the moment a lone scout crossed the Greasy Grass River. The Greasy Grass River was the Sioux name for the Little Bighorn River. And so essentially what they had happen, or what had happened was, they essentially had like teenage boys keeping watch on one side, and if something happened on one side, they would run over the ridge, and on the other side, there'd be a couple of guys on the lookout, seeing if those boys came over the ridge. If they came running over the ridge, they knew something was wrong, and they could immediately act, right? So one of the boys runs across the ridge, and a couple of people are, shouting that the soldiers are coming towards the village. Well, guess who was one of the guys watching for the boys that day? Yeah, Crazy Horse. Crazy Horse is watching for him. So Crazy Horse rallied the warriors, and they charged out over that second ridge. Now, Sioux did not make any large mounted charges against Custer's positions like Hollywood would have you believe. Instead, they held down Custer's men with long-range rifle and arrow fire from dismounted positions in sagebrush clusters, tall grass on small hills, and various small ridges. The Sioux used repeating rifles and pistols that they had either previously gotten from battles or trading or taken from dead soldiers. But the heaviest losses actually came from arrow fire. Because what can you do with arrows? You can bend their trajectory, can't you? Unlike bullets, right? So they would, if the Custer's men were behind cover or behind their horses or what have you, they would just, essentially, calculus comes in handy there, kids. Essentially use the calculus in their head, pull up, and arc their arrows and catch the soldiers that way. A lot of soldiers had arrows in their back, and at first people thought it was because, they were running away from the battle and they were shot in the back. But usually what we end up finding out later is that they were actually lying around cover and they had a group of arrows lodge in their back or do whatever, and that is what killed them. Crazy Horse's men delivered the killing stroke when they crossed the Little Bighorn River and rushed across to attack Custer's position. Each of Custer's companies, each of those three groups, had their own last stand. But the last stand that history remembers is Custer's group. The men tried to hold out as long as possible, even shooting their horses dead so they could use the carcasses for barricades. I don't know if they knew this, but I don't know if they knew that you could actually ride the horse away from the battlefield. Yeah, it's a novel idea, huh? But they didn't. They were like, I know what to do with this perfectly healthy horse. Shoot it. So that's what they did. But Crazy Horse's men eventually overran him. The Battle of Little Bighorn ended for Custer 2 hours after the hostilities commenced. So, now what happened with Custer is they find later, one, Custer not only lost his life, he lost the life of at least one of his brothers and at least one or two of his cousins, or it was 2 brothers and a cousin, something like that. He lost other family members that were close to him during this. And most of his men died. Some did escape, but not all of them. And obviously not all of them escaped. Afterward, they found Custer's body essentially mutilated, especially his hair cut up. Most likely those Sioux and Cheyenne warriors took parts of his hair as trophies to say that they had killed, the blonde one and, all this kind of stuff. So he's severely mutilated and his hair cut up whenever they found him. So after the Sioux do all that kind of stuff, which of course, after they did all that stuff, it led to a lot of embellishment things, in the American newspapers about how the Indians were cannibals and cut them up and did all this. That's not really true. They did mangle the bodies for sure. But most likely the mangling, especially of Custer, was more done on a trophy level as opposed to, cannibalistic or any other such nonsense. But after they did all that, the Sioux set fire to the prairie grass to create a smoke screen to aid in their escape from the valley there. The soldiers could see the large contingent of Sioux and Cheyenne winding their way up the ridges that led out of the valley on their way towards the Bighorn Mountains. The largest contingent of Lakota people to ever gather left the Greasy Grass Valley victorious. The Indians went to the nearby Bighorn Mountains to celebrate their victory, thinking they had shown the Americans that war with them was futile. They could have dealt a fatal blow to the army by following those guys, hunting them down and taking them to the fort and hunting them down and slaughtering them. But they didn't. They decided to go party in the mountains instead. Another thing, kids, don't party before your job is done. But instead of crushing and dealing a fatal blow to the army, instead they only strengthened the army's resolve to exterminate the Indians before they could flex their military muscle again. The army stepped up their ruthlessness after Custer's last stand, and the futility of the Indians' leadership was exposed. Crazy Horse was captured more than a year later while trying to adapt to reservation life. And after Crazy Horse was captured, Sitting Bull led his people to Canada before eventually returning. And Crazy Horse, when he was captured, he tried to adjust to a reservation life, but he kept leaving randomly. They kept being like, where the fuck is Crazy Horse? Where'd he go? And they're like, I don't know. And then he'd come back and he'd be like, oh, hey, I'm here. And then he'd leave again. Or he'd go to other reservations because he was trying to get his wife and trying to see his friends and, all this kind of stuff. And eventually they say, hey, come in, you need to come in and do all this kind of stuff. And eventually, one of his wives or his wife gets sick, and he, says, if you'll treat my wife, I'll come in and just help her, and I'll come in, I promise. So he comes in, and of course they arrest him as soon as he comes in with his wife, and he's with one of his close companions. His name is Touch the Sky. And Touch the Sky is called Touch the Sky because he is enormous. He is hugely tall. And he's so tall that he looked like he could touch the sky. So they bring him in, and everything's supposedly going peaceful and all this kind of stuff. And they take him to this house, and then they tell him that they're going to put him in a jail cell. Well, apparently he doesn't like that. He doesn't like being put into a jail cell, or the thought of it. And so, according to the army, he tries to run. He tries to bolt and run out and run away, even though he's in handcuffs and stuff like this. And according to the army, though, they settle him down and capture him outside. But then a private in the army is coming over, trips, and bayonets Crazy Horse in the back. That's what that depicts, is him going whoop and stabbing Crazy Horse in the back. There's Touch the Sky. There's one of the other officers trying to calm him down, and then old Clumsy here accidentally stabs, supposedly, Crazy Horse in the back, and Crazy Horse would eventually die. He bleeds out. It goes right through his liver, and he dies a few hours later. Of course, there's other reports saying that no, they intentionally murdered him. Even some of the army officials. There was a doctor there that said, who was a friend of Crazy Horse, said, I don't really think this was an accident. So when you kind of read between the lines, it seems like even the army doctor felt like he wasn't there when it happened, but he got the feeling that it may have been a murder as well. But either way, Crazy Horse dies in a very un-Crazy Horse type of way. Not everybody gets a nice, not all these great warriors get nice heroic deaths or live to be, to a ripe old age. And once Sitting Bull hears about Crazy Horse's death, and he kind of realizes, what are we doing? Why are we in Canada? What's going on? And so Sitting Bull comes back to the States, and he surrenders, and he goes to a reservation as well. So the Sioux and the Cheyenne and the other Plains Indians had failed in their quest to get rid of the American army, to get rid of the American government out of their lives, out of their land. And it looked so promising, especially there after the Little Bighorn. And a few years later, they're on reservations, essentially destroyed. So how did that happen? Why did the Sioux fail? The main thing that hurt the Plains Indians was the division among the tribes. Custer was led to Little Bighorn gathering of Sioux and Cheyenne by Crow and Arikara scouts. Remember the two rival tribes. Sitting Bull said correctly that they were an island of Indians in a sea of whites. If the Indians had put forth a united effort, the outcome of the Indian Wars might have been different. Maybe, maybe not. However, the concept of an army was foreign to the Indians and their individualistic cultures. The thousands of Indian warriors at Little Bighorn were there by chance and only held together for a few weeks before they went their separate ways. So even after that major victory, they didn't think, hey, we should all stick together. We do pretty well when we stick together. A few weeks later, they were like, all right, bro, see you later. Plus, remember who led Custer to those gatherings? Other Indians. They're not going to be all united. They just did not see themselves as one people, but several. While the government just saw them as one people. We already saw the dangerousness of that. I already explained that. So that's the big thing. It's just this division amongst them could never allow them to fully defeat the American government and the American army. They could win victories, but they wouldn't win the war. Another thing that led to the downfall of the Plains Indians tribes was the destruction of the buffalo herds, which gave the Plains Indians everything from food, clothing, shelter, to bones for arrowheads and composite bows. That further sped up the collapse of Indian military power. The indiscriminate slaughter of their main staple led many Indians to come off their reservations and attack buffalo hunters. Well, the attacks on the hunters brought the wrath of the army down upon the Indians when the army launched a campaign in retaliation for the killing of the hunters. The campaign was a complete success for the army and a complete and total disaster for the Indians. And what they really wanted, why the buffalo hunters were out there, some of them would just shoot buffalo as to pass the time when they were on trains. They would just sit on the top of trains or sit in, and point their guns out the windows, and they were bored and they just decided to pop buffalo. But the actual buffalo hunters were looking for hides and usually tongues and skulls, I believe. And but mainly the hides. The buffalo hides were in a big fashion back in the East, and so everybody was looking for buffalo hide this and buffalo hide that. And so it was mainly money and fashion that drove the destruction of the buffalo. Now, of course, the army and people who were against the Indians knew that if they killed more buffalo, that would speed up the demise of the Plains Indians. And that's what you can see here in this picture here. I mean, these are, normal size guys, I would assume. And this is a pile of buffalo skulls. I mean, each one of those individual little marks there is a buffalo skull. And look how big this pile is. Let's say this dude is an average height guy. For the time period, let's say he's 5'7". I have no idea how tall he is. Let's just say he's 5'7". So look how tall that is. Look how wide this is. And that doesn't even show the entire pile of buffalo skulls. Look here. These are all buffalo hides. And they're all laid flat. Those are all flatly laid. And look how high those piles are. It's a complete and utter destruction of the buffalo herds. And that's why now buffalo herds are protected and people are trying to make a comeback for the buffalo herds because they're native to the Americas. And, now, like, sometimes you go into burger restaurants and you get a buffalo burger, you may be thinking, oh, buffalo burger, they're killing buffaloes. They actually now have permits that you can raise buffalo to kill for burger purposes. And obviously other things too. But they're trying to bring back the North American buffalo because after all of this massive slaughter, they almost hunted them to extinction. So that's another thing that caused them to fail. Finally, a new religion brought about an Indian revival that pushed for Indians to fight against the Americans for their ancestors and for their progeny. So proper practice of the dance, they believe, would bring the spirits of the dead back to fight on their behalf, make the Americans leave, and bring peace, prosperity, and unity to native peoples throughout the region. And so this was called the ghost dance because they're trying to bring back the ghosts of their ancestors, the ghosts of the great warriors like Crazy Horse, to come back and lead them and lead this giant ghost army against the Americans. And then once they were done, the spirits would bring back the buffalo herds, and the buffalo would come back and be led by the white buffalo and refill the continent with themselves. That's why white buffalo were so important to Native Americans. They were seen as spiritual animals and things of that sort. So this new ghost dance religion that spread across the plains in 1889 and 1890, well, they're saying we're going to kill, they're dancing, they're doing the dance, and they're saying, well, we're going to kill all the Americans. Now, do you think that set well with Americans, or especially the U.S. Army? No. And the Army put down the new movement and crushed the last bastion of Indian hope of any kind for victory. And they came across these ghost dance sites and were just appalled by what they saw. Because what they saw during the dance, and what we've been told and have records of, and the Sioux even tell us this too, is that the ghost dance, part of it was actually fairly brutal. What they would do is some people would volunteer, and they would have a hot piece of metal, a hot like poker, run through them widthwise, through their rib cage. And they would poke that through, and poke it through the rib cage, and then have a clamp at the end, right? So they would be stuck on this pole, and the pole had a rope on it, and they would pull them up on the rope, up on this taller pole, and swing them around. And the person would flop around and act like a ghost, right? To bring back the ghosts. It's extremely brutal practice. Like that, I mean, God, that had to hurt, right? But it was to try to mimic the ghosts and bring the ghost back. And you won't see that in a lot of sources because some people just didn't believe that it happened, and others just thought it was so brutal for people to essentially string themselves up on poles and then whip each other around. But that was what scared a lot of people. I mean, you come up on a group of people that are stringing themselves up on poles and swinging each other around, you may be thinking, oh, these people are willing to do anything, right? So that's why they felt that because it was so fanatical, they had to crush it. They had to put down this last bastion of hope for the Plains Indians with the ghost dance. So we know what happened to the Plains Indians and their constant struggle with the American government and how that ended. So how did it turn out for those Southwest Indians, especially the Apaches? When we talked about their treaty in 1852, and we saw what happened with that and with Mangus Coloradus. Well, Mangus Coloradus was captured and killed, and the next man to kind of take the reins of the Apaches was a man by the name of Geronimo. And Geronimo had worked with Mangus Coloradus, had fought under him, and Geronimo was a Chiricahua Apache. That was his tribe within the Apache. And Geronimo really kind of stuck out amongst the Apaches. You kind of seen that with theme here with, Crazy Horse kind of sticking out, and Geronimo kind of sticks out. But Geronimo sticks out because he was enormous compared to other Apaches. Look at the picture there. That's all of him and his buddy standing next to each other, and there's Geronimo there at the far right, and he is definitely bigger than all of his compadres. I mean, obviously they're on a little bit of a slant, but not much, and he is a head taller than the tallest guys here, and look how much broader he is. He's just a big dude, especially for being an Apache. And the crazy thing is that Geronimo isn't even his real name. That's not his Apache name. But we hear Geronimo all the time. It's in our culture. And you may not even know who Geronimo is, but you've heard the name. People yell it for courage, jumping off of things, like little kids jumping off diving boards, or yell Geronimo. Doctor Who at one point has said Geronimo. It came from paratroopers, actually, whenever they were doing their first parajumps out of planes. To give them courage, they would yell Geronimo and jump out of the plane. So Geronimo is in culture and in our lexicon, but he's still kind of this mythical guy, and there's some kind of mystique around Geronimo and his name Geronimo, but it's not even his name. That's not even his Apache name. His Apache name was Goyathcla. And Goliathkla in Apache meant the one who yawns. The one who yawns. So, I mean, if he were an English speaker or if he was in an English speaking world, we'd probably nickname him Sleepy or something like that. So apparently he's a pretty laid back guy, just like to yawn a lot, you know. So how did this guy who was fairly laid back and yawned a lot end up becoming this badass warrior mystique kind of almost boogeyman type of kind of guy? How does that happen? Well, we'll see a lot of things that definitely drive Geronimo to becoming Geronimo, because he definitely earns the name Geronimo later. Now, the seminal moment in Geronimo's life happened on March 5th, 1851. Geronimo took his wife, his mother, and 3 young children to a Mexican fort with a large multitude of Apaches. The Apaches lived on the border of modern-day New Mexico, Arizona, and Mexico. They kind of wandered around in that area along the Gila River. You can see the territories there of where a lot of these Apaches would roam. And you can see on the chart down here is that they would come, down, and they would go down into Chiricahua, right? And the Chiricahua would go down here into Chihuahua and all this kind of stuff down into Mexico and trade, even though they were also at war. It was a very weird relationship that they had, right? So the men spent several days trading at this fort there in Mexico. And they left a small contingent to protect the women and children each day. So the men would go into the fort, trade. They'd leave a small contingent just in case, or something happened and they needed something. A small contingent of men to watch the women, children, and the older people. Well, one afternoon, some women and children ran screaming up to the men when they were returning from the fort. They said that a large group of Mexican soldiers attacked the camp, killed the guards, killed most of the women and children, took all of the horses and armaments, and burned all of their supplies, unprovoked. So the men rush back to the camp, and Geronimo heads straight to where his family was. And he opens where his family was, and he found his whole family dead, lying in a giant pool of their own blood. And he didn't say anything. He just stood there for a while. Then that night, he tells us later, there were no lights on in the camp. So without being noticed, I silently turned away and stood by the river. How long I stood there, I do not know. So he just kind of stared into the darkness next to the river. And on that night, Geronimo vowed to get his revenge against the Mexicans. Now, the Mexican local government pleaded with Mexico City to punish the soldiers, saying that the Apaches at the fort were peaceful. But in the end, the Mexican government cleared the soldiers of any wrongdoing. Soon after the massacre, 200 Chiricahua Apaches met with 100 Mexican soldiers and cavalrymen out in an open field in pitched battle. The Mexicans advanced to within 400 yards of the Apache before they opened fire on the Apache positions. Geronimo led the charge against the Mexicans. His courageous charge at the Mexican lines inspired other Apaches to follow him into the fray. And how he charged the Apaches, Geronimo rushed out into the open several times. He zigzagged his way across the field, each time killing at least one Mexican soldier, taking the weapons and ammunition, and he ran zigzagging his way back to his warriors. Because the Mexicans had spread themselves out. It wasn't just a plain flat field. There was little pockets of Mexican soldiers here and there because they got separated. And he would run zigzagging out there, right? Making sure, that's how you don't get shot. Zigzag pattern, zigzag pattern. And when he zigzags and he, jumps into a hole, maybe there's a couple of Mexican soldiers in there. He pulls out his big knife, stab, 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 stab. Stabs the soldiers, takes their guns, takes their ammo, and zigzags back to his men. The thing is that Geronimo really didn't like guns. I know you may be saying, Dr. Smith, you showed us a picture of him and 2 pictures of him holding guns. That was kind of staged kind of stuff. He really actually didn't really like guns all that much. He used them, but he didn't prefer them. He actually preferred his very large knife. And that's how he would go and kill most of these Mexican soldiers, is stick them with the knife. Although there was apparently during this battle with the Mexicans, now whether this is true or not, I don't know, but it's awesome and I'm going to tell you anyway. Apparently he did this kind of Hollywood type thing where he jumped into one like little area where 3 Mexican soldiers were, stabbed one in the throat, he goes down, another one's about to shoot him, he pushes the gun up, it fires up into the air, he flips it back, shoots the guy that just tried to shoot him, then turns around and shoots the other guy that tries to shoot him back, right? And then one of the guys wasn't fully dead, and he finishes him off with his knife, takes the guns, and runs back to his men. I mean, if you saw that in a movie, you'd be like, okay, whatever. And he totally did this, right? Even if he didn't do the awesome ninja moves, he's still zigzagging back and forth and killing dudes left and right, left and right, left and right, and then taking all their ammo and stuff and taking it back to his men. It's incredible. And Geronimo rushed out into the open several times doing that. Right? The Mexicans became so fearful when they saw Geronimo rush onto the field that they would yell, "Cuidado, cuidado, Geronimo, Geronimo." So if you don't speak Spanish, that means careful or caution. Jerome. Right? That's what Geronimo means. So Geronimo was earning his reputation as a man to be feared. And it's easy to see how he would become known for his ferocity and his ruthlessness in battle, to the point that Mexican parents would use Geronimo as a boogeyman type character to scare their children into doing what they were told. Like, if you don't eat your food, Geronimo will get you. If you don't go to bed, Geronimo will get you. Oh, I'll go to bed. But that's what they used him for. Right? Now, there's still an ongoing debate between historians as to why the Mexican soldiers called out Geronimo. Some believe that the Mexicans were appealing to Saint Jerome, but Jerome is the patron saint of librarians and scholars, a group that no one would be scared to run onto the battlefield, let's be honest. All right, so why would they be appealing like, "Oh, please, saint of librarians, help me"? Like, that seems weird. Some speculate that the battle took place during Jerome's feast day, but both Mexican and Apache accounts do not place the battle anywhere close to Jerome's feast day. So no matter why the Mexicans called him Geronimo, the name stuck. Not only did it stick with the Mexicans, it stuck with the Americans, and even other Apaches started calling him Geronimo. So even his own people quit calling him Goyathcla and started calling him Geronimo. So he earned the name. And he even said later, the name Goyathcla died with my beloved family in the subsequent revenge raid. Geronimo was born in the blood of my enemies. Woo! Damn. That's cold, but awesome at the same time. That's a dude bent on revenge. Now, the federal reservation system in the Southwest was a mess during Geronimo's time. The Mexican government is appealing to the American government, "Hey, you gotta help us out with these Apaches, man. They are fucking us up." And and of course the Apaches are starting to attack Americans too, so they're kind of getting involved with both governments. And the Mexican government is like, Americans, please help us. And so they tried to open up the reservation system to Geronimo, tried to get him to go to the reservation a couple times. The government would open reservations, then close them a few years later. They put different tribes on the same reservations in concentrated areas. That was really no good. And they regularly moved tribes around to various areas. So it was very chaotic. There wasn't a lot of stability there. Well, Geronimo, of course, hated this system and constantly escaped reservations so he could live freely without all the regulations, which, of course, made him an enemy of the American government. But can you blame him? I don't think so. The government spent the next 20 years capturing him and seeing him escape from reservations. The next 20 years. It's like this cat and mouse game. And seeing him escape from reservations until he finally surrendered in 1886. And when he finally surrendered in 1886, he was shipped off to Florida before he moved to Oklahoma. Before they moved him to Oklahoma, because they essentially punished him because he didn't know anybody in Florida. And he essentially surrendered because he's like, I'm old and tired and I want to see my friends. And they're like, oh, okay, sure, we'll do that. And we'll let you see your friends in a couple of years. And he was like, So they shipped him to Florida where he didn't know anybody. So it was kind of like prison, but not really. And then they finally let him go to Oklahoma where a lot of his friends were. And he actually technically spent the next 20 years as a prisoner of war. But during that time, he became a major American celebrity. He was his own walking exhibit at the 1904 World's Fair. It was like, see the famous Geronimo, and he'd just kind of walk around and be like, sup, and he apparently had a blast doing it. I mean, he was free to walk around the fair, and people talked to him, and all this kind of stuff. He even rode in Teddy Roosevelt's inauguration parade in 1905. Now, there's some debate on whether or not that Teddy Roosevelt was using him as an example of defeated barbarism or just showing off the pride of American West, or whether there's some debate on that, but we don't really know for sure. But he still got to march in Teddy Roosevelt's inauguration parade in 1905. Well, Geronimo, he gave him gifts. They did all sorts of stuff whenever he was out in Oklahoma. In fact, the picture that you see there on the right is his car. People gave him a car, and so he would drive around in his car around the around the plains, just kind of chilling out, and apparently you see him in a suit and a top hat. Apparently he liked to dress up like that every now and then and ride around in his car because he felt fancy, which is amazing. And but he obviously preferred his horse over the car. But I mean, hey, if somebody gives you a free car, I mean, you're gonna take it for a joyride every now and then. And he lived to be a fairly old age. And there on the left, you see him there when he's, I believe, in his late 70s or 80s. And even when he was that old, he would still go out at night and take rides on his horse. Well, one night he's out on his horse, out on the plains there, and he falls off the horse somehow. Either the horse gets spooked and throws him, or something. But he laid out in the cold all night. The funny thing is the horse still stood there, like in close proximity, so it must not have been terribly spooked. But he didn't come back that next morning, and so people went out and looked for him, and he had been laying out in the cold all night. And they bring him back, and he catches pneumonia. And he starts dying of pneumonia. Well, he ends up dying in 1909. And his last words were, "I should have never surrendered. I should have fought until I was the last man alive."